Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Israel says that all civilians are in bomb shelters after Iran launched missiles into the country after troops from Israel launched a ground incursion into southern Lebanon. As missiles are launched from Iran, warning sirens from Israel's Home Front Command are sounding in Jerusalem and across the country. And Israel's police say that at least 4 people are known to have been killed following a shooting attack in Jaffa. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We begin with the latest in Israel, where officials say that all civilians have been directed to bomb shelters. This after Iran launched missiles into the country. Warning sirens are reported to be ringing out across entire swathes of Israel, following on from an alert by Israel's Home Front Command. Well, this comes after a senior White House official warned that the US had information that Iran was indeed preparing to launch such a missile attack on Israel. Well, in another development, the Israeli police say that 4 people have been killed and 7 others have been injured after a gunman opened fire in Tel Aviv. Well, all this comes after Israeli forces entered Lebanon for what the military described as a limited, localized and targeted ground operation against Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Israeli airstrikes are ongoing in Lebanon. The IDF has confirmed strikes in Beirut, while Lebanese officials have reported that a building in a Palestinian refugee camp near Sidon has been hit. Well, for more on the situation, we can speak now to Simone Ledeen, who is the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I mean, Simone, events couldn't be happening any faster, a very rapidly developing situation across the region. Let's start by talking about this Iranian missile strike on Israel. What are your thoughts as you receive this information?
Well, I think in a way we should, in a strange way, almost be grateful for this because the mask is off. Israel has been in a conflict with Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran. But until now, Iran has sort of stayed in the background, content to let its proxies absorb the damage of Israel's response. I think now, in case it wasn't obvious before, the cat is out of the bag. This is Iran directing all of these activities, and now I think we're in a new phase of this conflict, very clearly so.
And what would you characterize this new phase as being, then, Simone?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I believe that Iran has come out of the shadows. Iran has launched this ballistic missile attack against Israel. And now it's unfortunately a full-fledged war between the two countries. I believe this is also a demonstration of the failed foreign policy of the Biden-Harris administration. Because their stated goal for the last several years, and especially since October 7th, was to avoid a regional conflict. And instead, what we're seeing is this escalating regional conflict that has now brought us to where we are today.
Well, to be fair, I mean, the Biden administration did urge for ceasefires, it urged diplomacy, and it appeared until last night that was their preferred course of action, although Lloyd Austin did give Israel the green light for this limited incursion into Lebanese territory. But you're saying that the diplomacy has been a failure. Is that the essence of what you're saying?
Yes, and I would use a different word. I would use the word appeasement. I think this administration has shown a policy and pursued a policy of appeasement toward the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I believe it's invited this level of violence. I believe Iran and its proxies viewed the United States as a weak country at the moment, and believed that now was the time to attack. Again, this began a year ago with Hamas attacking Israel. Israel defending itself, Israel going into Lebanon in the past days and attacking the leadership of Hezbollah in order to return its citizens to their homes in northern Israel. So unfortunately, this is something that Israel has had to engage in, has tried to avoid engaging in, and now, unfortunately, it's time to, I believe it's time for the United States to fully support Israel in its quest for peace for its population and citizens, and for the region. I believe after this conflict is over, and hopefully there's a decisive victory, I believe we can return to peace in the region.
There was a warning that came from Washington, a warning aimed at Iran, as it became apparent that this attack on Israeli territory was imminent. They warned of serious consequences. That's what Washington warned Iran of. What might we be talking of in terms of those serious consequences? What sort of scenarios can you envisage?
Well, it's hard to know what this administration means when it talks about serious consequences. It's also threatened serious consequences against the Houthis for their destabilizing activities in the Red Sea, and we really haven't seen serious consequences. Of course, there has been some response. For example, the targeting of the Hodeidah port the other day. And some would argue, actually, that was Israel's action and not the United States action, although reports do indicate that the United States was informed prior to that particular operation. But serious consequences in this context, it's hard to know what they mean because, again, up until now, when talking about the U.S. With respect to the Islamic Republic of Iran, has pursued a policy of appeasement. And there are many things that the United States could have done to prevent the situation from escalating to this point. And they did not do it. I understand the focus on diplomacy, and I think diplomacy is important. But when you don't have the teeth behind the diplomacy, you have to have a stick along with the carrot. And when you're just offering a carrot without a stick, there's really it's really less appetizing. So I think that's where we've landed, and we're seeing that play out, unfortunately. And now I think we're going to have to follow this to the end. And I hope that our leaders here in the U.S. fully support Israel and their need to defend their citizens.
Yeah, we're just getting word from the Reuters news agency. They're quoting Israeli army radio as saying that some 200 missiles were launched into Israel from Iran. That sounds like a huge number. Does this sound a bit like what happened in April when Iran carried out a similar retaliatory, they would say, strike on Israel, or is this on a different scale?
Again, these are initial reports, but I believe this might be a larger scale than what we saw in April. Of course, every time one of these sort of escalatory actions, back and forth exchange of missiles or drones or whatever it may be, today it's missiles. I believe that that each side learns from that and they adjust accordingly. I think we're also witnessing, unfortunately, an ongoing situation on the ground in Tel Aviv with active shooters and mass casualty situation. So there are multiple sort of lines of attack that are underway, and I think, I think it's important to note that as well.
Yeah, surely. I mean, a very fast-moving situation. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us, Simone Ledeen. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's cross now to Tel Aviv, and we can speak to our correspondent there, Trent Murray. Trent, just tell us the latest that you're hearing at this stage.
Yeah, Tom, well, we've just returned to our live position after spending about 30 minutes in the bomb shelter here, and that is because there were multiple signals sent out from Israeli Home Command advising Israelis to stay in shelter. Now, normally when there's a rocket attack, you will generally get one phone alert and then you're told to stay in place for about 10 minutes. What made this quite different was that there were 4 alerts sent in about 10 minutes apart. So that sort of tells me that there must have been multiple waves of missiles that they were trying to intercept. We have seen, just as I've come here, because we've left our camera recording, that while we were down in the bomb shelter, there was a direct impact somewhere behind me in Tel Aviv. It's a bit dark now, so I can't see the smoke, but there definitely was an impact based on 2 missiles landing here in this downtown area of Tel Aviv. Still very early days, but what the IDF is saying is that while those waves of missiles were coming, some 10 million Israelis were taking shelter based on those alerts that were sent to people's mobile phones.
Yeah, an Israeli army radio saying 200 projectiles were fired at Israel by Iran. Something similar happened in April, and I was just putting that question to Simone Ledeen there. Does this sound comparable to what happened back in April?
Well, it feels quite different, actually, because back in April, you might recall, the Iranians launched a series of drones first from their territory towards Israel, and that gave Israel and some of the allies that support it some forewarning that something was coming, given it takes several hours for those drones to cover such a long distance right across the Middle East here. I think based on what we've just seen, the Iranians may have dug deep into their ballistic missile arsenal, because it's thought they would only take between 10 to 12 minutes to arrive. I think given that there was just such little warning and that those sirens started sounding very, very rapidly, very quickly, it would appear, I would imagine, can't confirm, but based on what we've seen, I would imagine that they've fired ballistic missiles that were just very, very fast travelling and gave people very little time to seek shelter. So I guess the big question right now is the volume that was fired. Did it manage to overwhelm parts of the Iron Dome defence system by virtue of the number? I guess given that we have seen some impacts here, I'm in Tel Aviv, some parts of the Israeli defence array were not able to shoot down some of those missiles that were fired from Iran.
Developments coming in hard and fast, things are changing very rapidly. We've got information that Ben Gurion International Airport is closed for all flights coming in and out. I suppose that's pretty inevitable under these circumstances. We're also receiving word of another possible terror attack at a hotel near Tel Aviv. We probably don't have much information on that, but there was an active shooting situation in which 4 people were killed near Jaffa, I believe. Just tell us a bit more about what you heard on that front.
Yeah, not far from our position, actually. It's probably about a kilometre that way, Jaffa, and we certainly heard a series of police and paramedic sirens blasting through the streets here, and could tell something had happened, and then the report started to come through that there was some sort of mass shooting. What we've learned subsequently was that it appears there were 2 gunmen, and there are some photos circulating on Israeli media. One of them was carrying what looked to be a pretty heavy machine gun of some description, and it appears that they opened fire at a tram stop as people were either coming off the tram or waiting for the tram. Some pretty gruesome footage circulating here showing a number of bodies on the street, and just as that incident was occurring, there were paramedics down there treating people, and the police, I think, trying to ascertain the whereabouts of the gunmen. That's when the sirens went off for the Iranian missile attack. So it's obviously been a pretty dramatic and stressful hour or so, I guess, for Israeli emergency authorities, certainly here in Tel Aviv, contending within the space of 30 minutes or so with what appears to be a mass shooting or a terror attack of some description, as well as a major missile attack from Iran. You would imagine the Israeli security establishment right now is preparing to respond to what we've seen in the past hour.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for that. Our correspondent in Tel Aviv, Trent Murray, thank you very much indeed. Well, it's estimated that as many as 1 million people have been displaced in Lebanon as a result of the ongoing violence there. Well, today, the Lebanese Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, and the UN humanitarian agency appealed for more than $400 million in aid to help the people who've been displaced. Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Beirut by the head of communications for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. May Sayegh, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. This must be an extremely complicated time for you and your organisation. What are you able to tell us about the situation on the ground today and which areas have been most affected?
Yeah, good evening, and thank you for having me. The situation has deteriorated dramatically since mid-September. And as you have mentioned, there are now more than 1 million people displaced. If you go to Beirut, to downtown, to many areas in Beirut, you see people displaced, and they are literally sleeping in the streets. People have no safe place to go. We have seen, since the beginning of this escalation, that many areas are being affected now, and we have been seeing massive airstrikes all over the country, in Beirut suburbs, inside Beirut, in the Bekaa, in southern Lebanon. And this put a lot of pressure on the Lebanese Red Cross teams and volunteers who are responding and trying to do their best to support the affected communities and provide them with the urgent needs.
Yeah, and in terms of meeting the needs, I'm just wondering that in a situation where few flights are coming into Lebanon now, most commercial airlines have cancelled their flights. In terms of supplies, are things starting to run out? What sort of supplies are needed at this stage?
Yeah, it's indeed true. Now the Lebanese Red Cross, they have been responding since October 2023, and recently, since mid-September, the situation has deteriorated, and their now resources are depleted. And as you know, this puts a lot of pressure on the supply chain, given the security situation. So the basic needs are, and the eminent needs are now the medical supplies, the fuel, to make the ambulances of the Lebanese Red Cross operational. They have 51 ambulance centers across the country, and their teams need fuel to be able to move these ambulances and attend to the injured and transport also the dead people. In addition to that, the funding now, it's also the appeal we launched. IFRC has launched the emergency appeal for the Middle East crisis. So far, it's only 12%. Now we get the funds, and still the Lebanese Red Cross need a lot of support, financial support, to keep their operations ongoing. IFRC, in the last days, they released 2 million Swiss francs from the Disaster Response Emergency Fund to allow the National Society, the Lebanese Red Cross, to respond in a timely manner, because the needs, as you know, in the shelters, it's not only attending the injured and providing medical services, it's also providing relief items, providing medicine, shelter kits, and knowing that more than 850 shelter locations are scattered all over the country.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We're going to have to leave it there. May Sayegh, Head of Communications for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Thank you very much. Well, let's cross now to Washington, D.C., and we can speak to our chief correspondent, Simone Marks, who's standing by for us. Simone, these reports coming out of Israel, extremely alarming. We understand some 200 missiles were fired into Israeli territory. What can we expect by way of a response from Washington at this stage?
Well, we know that the Americans, of course, warned that this was going to happen, Tom, several hours ago. Highly unusual for them to go public with the detail of that warning, insisting that the United States was going to do everything possible to assist Israel in shooting down some of these missiles from Iran. And certainly early reports suggest that that may have been largely successful, although battlefield assessments will have to be taken, will have to take place by the Israelis possibly with the assistance of Western intelligence as well. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris spent the morning with their national security officials getting an emergency briefing at the White House. President Biden himself is due to be seen publicly in just over an hour's time for a completely separate event, but he may well face questions from reporters about what has taken place in Israel over the course of the last hour or so. As you know, Joe Biden has insisted that his administration is going to be ironclad in its backing of Israel's right to self-defense, despite what has been very evident, particularly over the last few days, the bruising of the relationship between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu, with Joe Biden on the sidelines of the United Nations reportedly telling people that he was livid with the Israeli leader for constantly saying things privately to the president and to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and then pulling the rug out from under them publicly a matter of hours later. The United States and France, of course, also trying to advance a 21-day ceasefire in Lebanon that, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu derailed by taking that action in Beirut to eliminate Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and several other senior Hezbollah commanders. But today, ironclad meant something in terms of the relationship between the United States and Israel, with, we believe, American assistance being offered militarily to Israel's efforts to intercept those missiles as they were on their way to Israel from Iran.
Yeah, we're hearing right now from the White House, in fact, that President Biden and Vice President Harris are monitoring the situation in Israel from the White House Situation Room. That's the latest we've got for you there. And as you were saying just there, to pick up on some of the points you made, and we may have to go back to what's happening in Israel in just a moment, but the Biden administration, as you said, has had some issues with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Biden administration was rather hesitant to sound like it was supportive of an Israeli ground offensive. And then last night we heard the Pentagon chief Lloyd Austin saying that he supported a ground invasion by Israel, but with sort of some what sounded like terms and conditions attached. What exactly did he say?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to parse all of that. He spoke to the Israeli defense minister over the weekend and said, once again, as he always does, that the United States supports Israel's right to defend itself and vowed serious consequences for Iran were it to launch an attack. He then went on to say, we agreed on the necessity of dismantling attack infrastructure along the border to ensure that Hezbollah cannot conduct October the 7th style attacks on Israel's northern communities. So by talking there about dismantling infrastructure along the border, he was almost drawing a line and saying you mustn't go further than that. But then came the news this morning that the United States had learnt of Iran's plan to launch these missiles at Israel, and the Americans say they passed that intelligence on to the Israelis, which is very relevant given the strains in the relationship between the two countries, and much of that restraint from Secretary Austin appears to have evaporated. He put a posting himself out on social media saying that he had spoken with the Israeli defense minister again today. I shared that over recent days, he said, the United States has increased force readiness and continues to maintain significant military capability in the region. We discussed the severe consequences for Iran in the event that Iran chooses to launch a direct military attack against Israel. Well, Iran has now done precisely that. So the next question for Lloyd Austin, officials at the Pentagon who will be briefing reporters soon, and indeed for President Biden himself, is what do those consequences look like, and how do you explain them if the aim of the United States here is to try and avoid all of this from spiralling into a much more dangerous region-wide conflict?
Yeah, and as we continue to follow these developments, the news keeps coming into us, different alerts coming to us from the various news agencies. We're just hearing now that Iran says it's ready for any type of retaliatory action taken by Israel. We're also learning that the order for those attacks on Israel came from none other than the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So if Iran is ready for Israel's retaliation, I mean, we're looking here at a cycle of retaliatory actions and a cycle of violence from which it's very difficult to see any way out.
And that is why, Tom, this is going to be such a test for the Biden administration, for the president, for the vice president, Kamala Harris. And remember, in just a few hours' time here, we're going to be seeing the only vice presidential debate of this election cycle between Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota and Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. That suddenly is going to feature more foreign policy, I think, than we would previously have expected as a result of what's taken place today. Does the United States still have the capacity to persuade Prime Minister Netanyahu directly and the Iranians indirectly through back-channel communications to knock it off after this? Or are we going to see more reprisals, as Benjamin Netanyahu has indicated, against Iran? He even put a note out to the Iranian people suggesting that change in governance could be eventually achieved in Iran. Those are the scale, that's the scale of his publicly stated ambition. What role can the United States play in potentially persuading these two warring parties to step back from the brink? Or are we going to see that spiralling regional conflict that the Biden administration has worked so hard for several months to avoid?
All right. Thank you very much, our Chief Correspondent, Simone Marks in D.C. Thank you. Well, let's get some analysis from the retired British Army officer who was the most senior British officer in charge of rebuilding Iraq. I'm talking about Major General Tim Cross. Major General Tim Cross, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here on Al Arabiya. We're monitoring multiple situations today. Can I just start by asking for your thoughts as we look at developments unfold in Israel, where we understand that some 200 at least 200 missiles, according to reports, have been fired from Iran into Israeli territory.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is not good news. But if I'm brutally honest, I'm not that surprised. I think Israel has obviously caused significant damage to Hezbollah in terms of its command and control structures and in terms of its overall fighting power and capability. And with all that's been going on there, and of course in Gaza and the Houthis and so on, I think Iran, who clearly is the sponsor for these guys, feels or felt that it had no option but to retaliate in some form. I'd rather hope they wouldn't, and they've made it clear up to now that they don't want a major conflict with Israel, as indeed did Hezbollah before that. I think they realize that Israel has got the capability of causing significant damage. But nonetheless, I feel that they felt that they had to retaliate. So the size and scale of this is really what we're talking about now. Obviously, the news is coming in, as you say, minute by minute. The issue is whether these missiles will get through, and some of them, we're told, are ballistic missiles, whether they will get through and cause significant damage to Israel or not. And we know that the last launch of a significant number of missiles and drones and so on from Iran did not cause much damage, if any damage at all, to Israel. Most of them were shot down. I think 5 got through and ended up in the desert. So if that is the case again this time, and Iran feel that they have done what needed to be done, that may be able to draw a line under it. But of course, the danger is, and my experience, over 43 years in the military, is that it's the unintended consequences. It's the reality that these things always take you into places you didn't really want to go. And drawing a line under this in terms of retaliation takes wisdom from statesmen and women, mostly statesmen in this case, who have the ability to recognize that simply ramping up escalation and retaliatory measures doesn't really take you anywhere.
Yeah, and I mean, another developing element to all of this, the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is in a secure location, says Tehran. So perhaps with in mind what happened to the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, officials have taken that decision to move him. Just with regards to the situation in Lebanon and the Israeli ground invasion, in your opinion, was Israel right to have begun what sounds like, in all fairness, the early stages of a ground offensive, or perhaps a very limited ground offensive? Do you think this was the right course of action, or do you think this is a mistake?
Well, their history in Lebanon is not great. We know that from previous, examples of these land incursions. On the basis of what I'm hearing, it is a limited incursion. And in that sense, if that is reality, then I think probably it will be okay. I mean, we have to recognize that Lebanon and Hezbollah have been launching rockets into Israel since October the 7th, on a regular and sustained basis. And therefore, a lot of Israelis have not been able to live in their homes and villages in the north. Now, that applies to the other side of the border as well, of course, as a result of what's been going on. So we've got the best part of probably 200,000 people and families not being able to live in their homes. Israel's intent is, as we understand it, to enable their families to go back. And therefore, I think what they're trying to do is to move into the north, take out some of these tunnels and weapons caches and restrict Hezbollah's ability to, continue with these rocket attacks. But if I'm honest, I don't see that really being successful, because Hezbollah clearly have the ability to launch rockets from much deeper inside Lebanon than just 10 or 15 or 20 miles inside the border. So I can understand why Israel are doing this, but if I'm honest, I'm not sure it was, from a military point of view, how successful it will be.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry to cut you short. We're out of time. Major General Tim Cross, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. And that is... Well, that is indeed all we have time for. Coming up next is Hadley Gamble's interview with the Georgian president. And at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, join me for Global News Today. That's a roundup of top international news with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives.
Much for joining us, and once again, thank you to the Warsaw Security Forum for having me. My name is Hadley Gamble. I am the chief international anchor for Al Arabiya, as well as a columnist and contributor for Semaphore. Madam President, welcome. You have elections coming up on October 26th. In your mind, will democratic values prevail?
Well, the democratic forces, the pro-European forces in Georgia, have always been there. Have always been the very vast majority of the country. They know where is our future. They know that we have no alternative. So I'm very confident that the Georgian population that has been for 30 years, despite the war that we were mentioning, despite all the attempts of Russia to derail the European path of Georgia, 80% of the population over the years steadily is supportive of the European path and the European future. The elections that we're going to have on 26th of October are going to be determining. There are many forces that are at work against the will of the Georgian population, but I'm confident that our future is in Europe. Our future is also defended by Ukraine, as Ukraine is fighting for itself, for its independence, for Europe's freedom. Ukraine is also fighting for our freedom. And the stake of Europe will be determined by the outcome of the war in Ukraine, by the outcome of the elections in Moldova, by the outcome of the elections in Georgia. That will determine, for instance, the security of the Black Sea and the future of the Black Sea as a sea of cooperation, as a sea of peace and connectivity. That will determine the role of Europe in the Caucasus, of Europe and of our Western partners. That will determine the future of Armenia, which is now on its path also towards getting closer to the European Union. So everything that is at stake these days is very important, and more important than anything else, what it has at stake is peace. Peace through the expression of the free will of the people in Georgia as in Moldova.
And the free will of the people, at least with regards to the current government, seems to be one in which democratic freedoms are being rolled back. How dangerous is this new reality for Georgia?
Well, it's dangerous. We are the other side of the coin, that Ukraine is experimenting the military aggression. We're experimenting another type, which is the hybrid war, propaganda, pressure of all kinds, fear that is used, suppression. We have had this Russian law, which is now in action and tries to suppress the civil society, to restrict it. That's what is at stake in the elections. And again, I think that by the elections, the Georgian people will overcome these threats, which are very real. I cannot just minimize them. They're very real, but I'm confident that the strength of the people, of the Georgians that have lived through very many pressures and fears and struggles to defend their independence and their European future, I'm sure they will overcome.
What do you say to many of those citizens who, as you say, they've lived through 2014? The West was nowhere. They see what happened to Ukraine and they think it's better to just bow down, get through this, and allow Vladimir Putin's influence to spread. What is your message to them? Because there are a lot of those people.
No, there are not a lot of these people, because Georgia has had many experiences with Russia before 2014, before 2008. It started each time Georgia was independent. It started in 1921. It was the same after the independence in 1991. So the Georgian people know that bowing down does not bring peace, does not bring you any form of accommodation with Russia, that it doesn't work.
Yet the current government, though, seems to be doing that.
Well, they're trying to, yes, that's the narrative.
Some people do support this.
Yes, there are some people that will support, although it's a small group that is more around these authorities because of privileges, because of corruption, because of pressure, because of compromise. We are in a situation where we see the replication of Russian modus operandi. And Russian law was a sign of that the authorities, because they cannot gather support any longer, are trying through different methods, through different laws, to really put pressure on the society. But again, I'm confident in the society because we've had enough historic experience to know where is our future.
Given that experience, how likely in your mind is it that Vladimir Putin would take military action if things in Georgia don't go the way he wishes?
That's certainly not an hypothesis that I will voice. And I don't think that Russia is in a position to try that, although you can never say never about anything. But I think that the strategy that Russia is using today in Georgia is to use what has become a proxy, which are the Georgian majority. The Georgian dream has become really a proxy for Russian interests. So that means that their immediate strategy is not a military one. I think that Ukraine is enough for them. I hope so, but I hope that Ukraine will get stronger. I think that the answer to all these threats is really the solidarity around Ukraine, is strengthening the Ukrainian defenses and allowing Ukraine to win the war that they are fighting for us.
Remember, of course, that most analysts did not believe that Vladimir Putin would put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and yet he did. And to your point that you don't foresee this happening in Georgia, what is the plan if it does?
There is no plan if it does, because Georgia is not Ukraine. Georgia doesn't have the military strength. That will be another crisis for you.
We got a lot of them.
You got a lot of them.
Yeah.
So I think that we are not there, and I think that these elections are something for us to defend peacefully, and to express ourselves. I think that the mobilization of the Georgian people in the elections is the real answer today.
Speaking of it all falling on us, and I speak of the collective we of the West, What is your message to those today who would say, it's a lot of money spent on Ukraine, we want this to come to an end, peace at any cost?
There is no peace at any cost. Those of us that know history know that there is no peace at any cost. There is peace only when it's just. There is peace only when the populations have their freedom and when countries have their independence. There will be peace, and I'm convinced of that, the day when Russia will understand that, as any other nation in the world, it has borders it has to respect. It has to know, first of all, where are its borders, respect the borders, respect its neighbors, and accept to be in its own frontiers. That is the only peace that is a lasting peace.
What is something that we in the West should be doing to help Georgia at this point? Because you were talking about the strengthening, obviously, of democratic institutions, but also combating what is a major campaign by the Russians in order to convince people that their lives would be better off in that sphere of influence.
Well, again, I don't think that it's from outside that you can strengthen the inner defense of the people. I think that we have our history, we have our knowledge of Russia. We are more resilient to Russian propaganda than many other countries because we have lived through it. So people see through what is happening. I'm going to give you one example. A few days ago, there were, for the electoral campaign, big posters used by the majority, the ruling party, that described on one side the destruction in Ukraine, and on the other side, similar buildings in Georgia that look very fine. And it just started a big uproar in the population because it was so not in line with Georgian culture, with Georgian tradition, to be gloating about one's peaceful living while the other, the friend, is living in this tragedy.
There was
so
outrage,
it was,
and it was real.
Hmm?
It was outrage, and it was real.
It was outrage, it was real, it was spontaneous, and they had to withdraw some of the videos of the same kind. Yes. They couldn't withdraw the billboards.
So your feeling is that all is not lost in this fight?
I'm persuaded that all is not lost. I'm confident, and I'm confident because I know the Georgian people.
Yeah. How concerning is it to you that one of the candidates for the U.S. election has said repeatedly that he wants to put an end to the war in Ukraine, and he would negotiate with Vladimir Putin to do that, and I'm talking about Donald Trump?
I don't know. You know, once you are in responsibility, and it's one thing to say before a number of things, and the other thing is to, when you are in power, what is it that you are going to do? I believe that the American policy is very much a bipartisan policy, at least when it concerns Georgia. We know that it has always been a bipartisan policy. And I guess that concerning Ukraine, it will be a bipartisan policy because the reality on the ground is such that I don't think that any American president can ignore that and just give an easy win to a Russia that really up to now has been losing the war. Because for Russia not be able to win the war after 2 years and a half against what it thought that was going to be a 3-day campaign is already a loss.
Yeah. Georgia is a tough place to be an elected official. You found it to be so in your case. Saakashvili is still in prison. In your mind, what needs to happen to the judicial system in Georgia?
Complete reform. That's in line. That's on the Georgian Charter, which has been now signed by all the pro-European parties, which commits to very early in the next months after the election to really start a deep reform of the justice system.
Because at this point it seems like a dangerous place to be a politician.
I've been impeached by the Constitutional Court, although there were 3 judges that dissented from that, which is already a reason for hope. So we have to do that, and that has to be done very quickly. And I think that very quickly also we have to, with our European partners and American partners, restart all the process of getting closer to European Union, of getting closer to American partner, to restart the military exercises that have been suspended now until the elections. We have many things to do, and I'm hopeful that we'll be on track.
Do you believe today that Mr. Saakashvili will receive a fair trial?
Well, the trial has been going on. There are many different trials. There is not just one trial. There is nothing that can be fair today in Georgia's tribunals today.
Yeah.
So you'll have to wait for the next.
It's a long time to wait. Finally, Madam President, just walk us through specifically what it is that Georgia needs from Europe and the United States today.
Support to the Georgian population, the moral support, because today there is nothing much in 1 month's time that can be done. Moral support to the Georgian population and lots of observers during the elections, because that's the way that Georgian population is going to feel supported during the elections. Even if the observers cannot really change much to the outcome, they are not interfering with the elections, but they are a sign that we are not alone. What is always the most difficult for Georgia, it's a small country, it's to feel isolated. Isolation is for us the worst nightmare.
Madam President, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Fantastic opportunity to once again welcome an amazing group of panelists. We're going to be talking about Pax Americana. It is at the end of Pax Americana, and as an American, it's a tough topic to even be contemplating. But I suppose we're just going to have to work our way through it. I just want to mention that everyone on this stage is an American, with the exception of one man. Just to welcome my guests, it's fantastic to have them. Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine's negotiations. We're also joined by the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy and Humanitarian Rights, Daphne Rance. Nice to see you. Lord Vernon Coker, our resident non-American, Minister of State for Defense for the United Kingdom. By General David Petraeus, who's the former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And I'm also very pleased to welcome James Carafano, the Senior Counselor to the President for the Heritage Foundation. Panelists, welcome. I think it'd be just a moment, and I'm sure it'll make everyone really uncomfortable, but I'm going to do it anyway, to take a step back and say we are just a few weeks away from the election of a new president. And this could have major implications for our foreign policy, but also our domestic policy as well. And I want to get a very brief sense from the folks up here on this stage of who would be better for America, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Kurt?
That's really a very difficult question. Here's the way I look at this. We have, in the United States, always flirted with isolationism. At the beginning of the founding of the Republic, George Washington said, avoid entangling alliances. We had the America First movement in the 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt really had to struggle to get the U.S. to deal with World War II and Nazism, and it took Pearl Harbor to get the U.S. to do something in World War II. We are in that again. And I'll remind people the campaign slogans that presidents have used to get elected over the last 20 years. President Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. President Bush, no nation building abroad. President Obama, we're going to end 2 wars. President Trump, America first. So this is a trend. And I'd say there's a passive form of isolationism, which is we want to avoid escalation, we want to avoid conflict, we need to manage crises, but it's always also with a view towards we don't want to take anything on unless we have to. And then there's a more proactive isolationism, which is what you get from some of the America First crowd, the MAGA crowd. James can comment on that. As a country, for the last 70 years, we've traditionally had people from both parties believing in American leadership, an international role for the United States. You know, our values are our interests are our values, and we have to stand up for our values in the world and our interests in the world. That's always been there. It's still there. It's not gone. This exists in both parties. But we are facing now in this election more prominence to either the passive or the active form of isolationism. And it's a tough call.
I didn't hear an answer there. Daphne.
Sure. So I would just add onto this discussion of agree with the natural vacillations between isolationism and internationalism by making the point that America and its very old democracy are really based on an international foundation. And beyond the political elite and the foreign policy leaders, we have a very generous group of people in America who have long given charities abroad, who are very committed to international causes. We have universities that are increasingly building ties around the world, and that is without regard to political party, to state, to who's the president of the United States. So that, if you look at those trajectories alone, are only increasing. We have cities that are acting really as international centers of commerce in the United States, whether San Francisco, Chicago, or even smaller cities. So the engine of internationalism is way beyond the Beltway, beyond Washington, D.C., and that is only growing the interest in exchange programs in commerce, in tourism, and I see no end to that internationalist impulse among the American people.
Lord Coker, who would be better for the West?
Well, you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to answer the question because it's not a matter for me to comment on American domestic policy, and it's a choice for the American people to make. But what I would say is that I think it's important to remember that the US and Europe have always been indispensable allies to each other and important allies to each other. And I think it's really important that in today's geopolitical climate, the UK and Europe need each other. And I made the point this morning that what happens in the Indo-Pacific affects Europe, what happens in Europe affects the Indo-Pacific. And as such, I think the UK, with the US, with Europe, and with our other allies across the world, are going to need to stand together to deal with some of these crises that they face. And they'll have to do that together. And I think that will be true whoever were to win the next American presidential election.
General.
So I stopped voting when I was promoted to 2 stars, and I haven't started since. And I don't endorse candidates of either party, and I actually advise candidates of either party who are serious. So I'm not going to answer the question, but what I will do is say that I think regardless of who wins the election, it won't be the end of Pax Americana. Obviously, one candidate is a little bit more associated with America First, but actually that didn't translate into true America First. If you look at what happened in NATO during that period of time, we returned tanks to the mainland, European mainland. We pushed our headquarters out into Poland. In fact, he loves Poland. They were going to name Fort Trump for him out there. So again, I think you can overstate what the results of this might be. Certainly one a bit leaning in one direction, the other would be much more status quo. I'm a little surprised that an actual member of a political appointee of the administration dodged the question, and we might return to that. But I think, again, the U.S., by and large, there's bipartisan recognition of the importance of U.S. leadership in the world, but very much with allies and partners, because the number of plates that we're all trying to keep spinning simultaneously, representing the different challenges and threats, is greater than at any time since the end of the Cold War. And the biggest plate in that tent, bigger than all the others together, which represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China, that one has to be rock solid. And as our Lord here recognized appropriately, what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. And if you want deterrence to be solid in the Indo-Pacific, which rests on a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other, if you don't come to the help of a country that is threatened, its very independence is at stake, that embraces the same values and principles that we in NATO do against a dictator, a kleptocrat who is animated by a grievance-filled, revisionist and revanchist view of history, if you aren't going to support them, who's going to believe you that you're going to come to the support of someone directly, not just enable them to preserve their independence? So I think that recognition will still exist on Capitol Hill as it does right now, despite the lengthy, overly long discussions before the latest extraordinary amount of aid, $61 billion, was approved some months ago.
David, do I get an answer from you?
So I can't believe you asked the guy on the far right, who's. Here's what I will say with absolute 100% certainty and confidence, that regardless of who wins the President of the United States, America is not leaving NATO and we are not abandoning Ukraine. I think it's true.
Applause.
I think what the exciting differences are going to be on energy policy, Middle East policy, Latin American border security, and Africa. I think those are the things that really might turn in different directions depending on who wins.
General Petraeus, and I do want to pick up on that just with regards to the Middle East. Considering the amount of military hardware that we've moved into the region over the last several months, I would say 6 months to 12 months, given what happened in Gaza, that looks like mission creep to many people. What does this
actually to a former Central Command commander, it looks like rationality. We have always been irrational in our effort to leave the Middle East. We used to have 3 CENTCOM truths, we called them, when I was privileged to command the greater Middle East after Iraq and before Afghanistan. The first of those is, in the Middle East, be very clear who your enemies are and who your friends are, and don't confuse the two. And we have it a little bit at times. Iran is our implacable enemy, dedicated to the destruction of Israel and getting the U.S. out of the Middle East. Israel and the Gulf states and others are our friends, even if there's periodic friction and disagreement on certain specific issues from time to time. Number 2, Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there does not stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and in some cases tsunamis of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into the countries of our most important NATO allies. And then number 3 is that this effort to leave is just not rational. The U.S. trying to leave the Middle East is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in. So we should recognize, again, I'm not saying that the current level is necessary, but certainly these efforts to constantly pare down, unsettle our friends and allies, and embolden Iran and its malign proxies in the region. So I think, again, and with great respect, I'm not sure that the difference will be that profound in the Middle East. The current administration is supporting Israel just about 100%. Israel is being enabled to do what they believe is right, even when in some cases it's somewhat at odds with some of allies and partners, including some of our administration, doing a remarkable job in decimated. They haven't just decapitated Hezbollah. They have decimated their leader structure. They have done enormous damage, 1,500 targets alone to the much feared, in many respects, Hezbollah capabilities to simultaneously hit Israel and overwhelm the integrated air and ballistic missile defense system. Really impressive operations there, frankly. Although need to keep encouraging, there needs to be a vision for an end state for the Palestinian people in Gaza, which is lacking right now. It needs to be based on security that has to be achieved before you can really bring that about.
Do you believe that the United States needs to have a central role in that plan?
Oh, absolutely. It does have a central role, and it is. And again,
in the rebuild of Gaza.
Everybody's going to have a central role in that. The reconstruction, this is where the Arab states will come in very much, and others, but you can't do that without security. And security means that you don't have Hamas reconstituting after every single raid, and that the place is not run by criminal gangsters and remnants of Hamas.
Lord Coker, I have to ask you, I'm now living in London, so I'm a UK resident, although an American citizen, so this is very personal to me. Keir Starmer's government so far has managed to avoid at least the UK press. They're not doing any interviews. They're not really talking that much beyond this narrative that things are really bad and we got to work hard to change them. In your mind, how does this set up the United Kingdom to avoid the conversation that we're having right now? Is this the end of Pax Americana? Is this the end of United Kingdom's influence abroad?
The UK's influence around the world. Yeah, no, I mean, I think the Prime Minister was very clear at the United Nations, where he was a few days ago, where he talked about the UK's importance, the importance that the UK attached to its global role, not on its own, but I think, as has been said by others on the panel, working with our allies and our friends across the world. We keep making the point. Obviously, we have a NATO first policy. That's really important with respect to what's happening with Ukraine. We've been clear about that. We've said that, and the Prime Minister has said that at length. But that doesn't mean that we don't recognise the importance of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. And that's why, for example, the Carrier Strike Group will go there next year. It's been very clear about that. And we're looking to work with our friends and allies across the world, through NATO, but also through our other alliances. AUKUS is another really good example of the sort of work that we're doing to ensure that the UK plays its proper place in the world. And as I say, what the Prime Minister said at the United Nations was really important about that. And the UK will play its part. It can't do it on its own, but we cannot turn away from the global challenges that we face. Everybody in this room is united by the desire to protect freedom, the international rules-based order and democracy. That can't be done by one nation on its own. We need the US to work with us to do that, of course, but it would be the US with the UK, with our allies, many of whom are represented in this room. And that's the geopolitical reality of the challenge that we face today. It wasn't where we expected to be. If you'd have asked us a few years ago, perhaps many of us, including myself, would not have foreseen where we are. But we are where we are now, and the response that is coming, irrespective of the result of the American presidential election, I believe that people across the world, in terms of our alliances, including the US, will understand the importance of standing up for those freedoms and those rights. The US has always done that, and I think will do so in the future. And it's important for all of us that we work with the we work with the US to deliver that, because it's in all of our interests that it does so.
And the UK, we should remember, walked point for many of the early decisions when it came to supporting Ukraine. First one, hundreds of anti-tank guided missiles. We all watched, nothing happened. U.S. plows in thousands of them. Same with the longer-range anti-ship missiles. Same with the longer-range Storm Shadow. Repeatedly, the UK has made the first move. U.S. watches and then piles on with enormous assistance.
It's that relationship.
Yep.
I would just add on, I couldn't agree more, and I would actually reframe the Pax Americana paradigm that you've organized us around to, the post-1991 expectation that democracy would teleologically or naturally be on the march. That's what we're recognizing in the past 10 years or so, that we have to do much more work to protect, promote it, and to prevent authoritarian revisionism. And, credit to President Biden for really understanding this, this diagnostic and framing a lot of his geopolitical concerns in this maybe, binary between democracies and authoritarian regimes. But essentially, post-1991, and maybe with a little bit different arguments after 9/11 in our country, there was an assessment that the democratic order would just endure naturally, that the UN Charter could be self-preserving, and that naturally anyone or every country would grow to recognize the universal rights of their people because they were natural, and that just hasn't happened. Instead, in the past 10 years, there's been growing authoritarian threats, and many countries that were on the bubble in between, a liberal democracy and authoritarianism have backslid. And so it's incumbent upon all of us here to recognize the importance of actively promoting and defending our allies, and then working with democratic allies to counter this global trend.
It's a difficult one, and just a question to you, because you are a representative of the current U.S. government, of the Biden administration, and you are working with the Department of State. How does the Biden administration justify the thousands of people who've lost their lives in Gaza and Lebanon? Because the Arab Street certainly doesn't agree with what's happening there.
Absolutely. And first, I should just say that this is a real tragedy, and I think everyone in the U.S. government understands the loss of civilian life. The U.S. government strongly supported, after October 7th, the State of Israel, and continues to have ironclad support for the security of the State of Israel. And as Secretary Blinken has said again and again, far too many lives have been lost. And that runs through everything we do at the State Department in terms of our actions to protect civilian harm, to protect humanitarian access. We work every single day. But above all else, we are working tirelessly toward a ceasefire. And that is fundamentally a civilian protection, what we believe will be the best way to address the tragic loss of life.
So we heard earlier from the president calling repeatedly for a ceasefire, and then a report in Politico suggesting that members of his administration, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein, gentleman that I've interviewed on a number of occasions actually agreed with the Israelis on what's been happening in Lebanon, on this incursion, which has left thousands of people dead, that they gave the green light for it. How can you justify that?
So I would defer to the White House on the exact decision-making in terms of recent negotiations with the Israelis on Lebanon. I would just go back to the fundamental policy of the Biden.
Because thousands of people have died.
Yes.
Innocent civilians, women and children.
Which lays at the feet of Nasrallah, or Hassan Nasrallah, and also at the feet of Hezbollah.
General, with all due respect, a lot of people don't believe that, but go ahead.
Hell, a lot of people think the world is flat, but that doesn't mean that I agree with that.
I think the theme here, and this is what I was trying to speak about earlier, the danger is American weakness. So you have an isolationist drive on the, on a more passive side where we won't do things versus a more active type of isolationism or a more volatile, chaotic potential from the U.S. But in the case of the Middle East, General Petraeus mentioned this, we have not held Iran accountable. Iran has promoted these groups that have been attacking Israel, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis have been attacking not only them, but also international shipping. And you can look at the situation today and see we have escalating war in the Middle East. We have a 2.5-year war with no end in sight of Russia against Ukraine. We have growing risks in East Asia with China taking islands and threatening Taiwan. We've had Maduro just stand up to the U.S. and say, I'm not leaving. We have an escalating series of crises, and they're linked together. If you look at the way North Korea and Iran and China and Russia are all cooperating in ways that weren't true a couple of years ago, this is all, I think, a product of lack of willingness to confront problems and a perception of weakness. And that's the danger on that side. I may view that as the greater danger, but we also have to look at the danger of a volatile and chaotic American administration as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to back to the subject. First of all, to say that I think Paxes and polls and all this stuff is the seventh circle of hell of political scientists, and I think it's just stupid arguments. But I think there are at least three areas where America's power is both indisputably going to be strong and vital. We don't talk about nuclear at all. And what's not discussed is there's been an incredible transformation in the United States where almost nothing is bipartisan. So over a decade ago, we started with President Obama on a road to zero. We've not only abandoned the road to zero, that the idea of nuclear modernization is now completely bipartisan. The support for a triad is completely bipartisan. The recognition that the United States needs to have a nuclear deterrent that's sufficient to deal with both China, which is going to be equivalent to the U.S. and Russia, and be able to deal with regional threats, including potentially breakout. This, I think, and adding to that, because an offense-defense mix is what really brings stability, is the recognition in the United States of the importance of missile defense and growing and expanding air defense. This, I think, is an incredible power that the United States brings to the table, which is dramatically important in global stability. Energy. We say the United States, but it's really the United States, Canada, and Mexico together are truly the world's global energy superpower. And if the United States unleashes an interest in putting as much affordable, reliable, dependable, abundant energy into the global system, that I think is powerful and transformative. And the other one, which we often don't talk about, is foreign direct investment. I think last year the numbers were like 14% decline in foreign direct investment in China. That's a lot of money, and it's got to go somewhere. And you couldn't even spend it all in the United States if you wanted to. That is a powerful instrument, and there are lots of places in the world, if you think about connecting all the potential free and open spaces together. Whether we're talking about building out the 3 Cs initiatives or building out the middle corridor and bringing the energy and resources and connecting that to the global market, or getting back to the Abraham Accords and joint development and expanding capacity of throughput through the Middle East or the Southern Corridor. I think American FDI is a truly transformative power that we really intend to tap. And those things, I do think, make a big difference. If you want to call that Pax Americana, whatever, but it's just the reality of what America is going to bring to the table. And that's indisputable, regardless of who's president of the United States.
That economic diplomacy is something that the United States at various times either leans into or seems to pull away from. But I wanted to get a show of hands in this room. Who believes that if there is a threat to Taiwan, America will come in and save the day? Raise your hand if you think that America will defend Taiwan. It's not a full house. Many, but not a full house. General?
My hand is in the air.
I see that, yes. What does that say to you, that not every hand is in the air?
It says that we need to, while still preserving our policy of, strategic ambiguity? We need to clarify that policy. I mean, look, this is why President Biden on 4 occasions, not 1, 2, 3, 4, has seemed to slip up and say, we'll come to the aid of Taiwan. His national security advisor rushes out to the podium and says there is no change to our policy of strategic ambiguity, but this is all trying to convey that we will indeed do that. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, you have to be really conscious of the elements of deterrence. Exactly. Assessment of capabilities on one hand and willingness to employ them on the other. And by the way, we've taken some actions in recent years, both administrations, by the way, both of the recent administrations, one of which decided to get out of Afghanistan, even though we had 2,500 troops, hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months, and was very affordable, and then the other which followed through. That sent quite a message. I think that was one of a number of factors that probably convinced Putin that he could do what he did and get away with it, which he obviously did not. Huge miscalculations in a number of different regards. I was in actually the office of the Prime Minister in Singapore when the red line in the Obama administration about chemical weapons use in Syria turned out not to be a red line. And he said, you know what, General? That has repercussions out in the South China Sea. So we've really got to be conscious. And again, the minister mentioned earlier, what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. We need to be aware of that, because those, some running for office, who say, well, the Indo-Pacific, that's the priority. We can't do Ukraine and the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. I think that's seriously wrong. If you show that you can't do Ukraine, why would they believe that you're going to do Indo-Pacific? And by the way, again, we're not fighting and dying in Ukraine. We're not fighting and dying on the ground in the Middle East. We're fighting certainly the Houthis. But that's a very different situation. Taiwan would be much more significant than that. So you've got to show that you're willing to do this if you're going to have anybody believe you about that.
No doubt about it. 2 days ago, I was in Moscow. I was sitting with the Deputy Prime Minister, who's also the Minister of Energy, a key architect of the OPEC Plus agreement with the Saudis. You may have seen the report a few days ago that perhaps the Saudis, after December, will again attempt to reclaim some market share. That, of course, could have serious repercussions for a petrodollar economy like Russia's. I asked him, you know, how painful could this get for you? On the heels of the fact that they're going to be spending 25, 30% more on their military. And he said, you know, we're okay until the lowest price. We can take the pain, was the answer. General, is that your assessment?
No, I think a gas station with guns, or nukes, as you might describe the Russian Federation, is in real trouble if the price of Brent crude drops substantially. By the way, I'm a little bit skeptical about this all happening. It's pretty low right now, and that's because, you know, it's a supply and demand issue. Demand hasn't come back the way people expected, particularly when it comes to China. And then you have the situation where the U.S. is already far and away, you know, the swing producer in the world now is the U.S. and actually Mexico and Canada together. The U.S. far and away produces more crude oil and natural gas than any other country in the world. We're now a net exporter of crude, which very few people thought would ever be the case. We're not totally self-sufficient. We have more light crude than we need, a bit more heavy crude for our refineries than we produce. But we're going to become potentially the largest LNG exporter, which no one thought either, in part because we didn't even have any liquefaction plants. We had regasification. So this is really remarkable. Yes, you know, permitting could be faster, but we're already at this position. Having had both Republican and Democratic administrations in recent years. Saudis are very conscious of that. I remember being asked when I was Central Command Commander, you know, can't you just tell Exxon and Mobil and Shell to stop producing as much as they are? And I said, you know, we sort of respond to market forces, not central direction. So, look, price goes down, Russia's in a tough spot. And by the way, the long-term damage to the Russian economy, I think, will take years to see. But this brain drain that has taken place, the exit of the oil majors, so they're not actually in the process right now of doing the really tough drilling through the permafrost and so forth to replace what is going to deplete in the years that lie ahead. But right now, they're still pretty strong, and as you noted, devoting enormous resources to their military, which is what is enabling them to continue to get incremental gains in the southeastern part of Ukraine, even though they're just losing really almost unimaginable numbers of soldiers for someone who spent almost every night in combat writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers.
Kurt, I know that you've been on the front lines of this in many ways, but also as an advisor, in an advisory capacity. What do you say to those in Ukraine who are worried about either candidate winning this election simply because they think that we are getting into a situation where there's less capacity to support Ukraine?
Well, what I would say, I want to start with where General Petraeus left off. Not only is he right about the impact of lower prices on Russia, that should be our objective. We should be doing this. We should be ramping up our production of everything possible. We should be working with Saudi Arabia exactly to get them to do what they're thinking of, which is to increase their production as well. Our taking a more strategic approach toward Iran will be an essential part of getting Saudi Arabia to do that. But I think this has to be our goal. I mean, do you know that under the current U.S. policy, Russian banks are exempt from the application of U.S. sanctions if the payments are for energy? That's crazy. That should be our number one target, is to go after those payments.
Some NATO allies had something to do with that, as you may recall.
But all because we are worried about the availability of supply, which we could be doing something about. So I think we have to reformulate this entirely. Having just come from Ukraine last week and multiple visits over the last couple of years, I'll just tell you, and Ukrainian friends in the audience here can chime in, but I perceive that Ukrainians are far more worried about more of the same than they are worried about a little bit of rolling the dice, because more of the same is slow death to them.
James.
Look, I agree. So this is something that I think we're all missing. And maybe Dave has a different view. I don't know, because we were both there on the front lines. But, I was there in the Cold War in '89. I think the frontier of NATO is more defensible today than it was during the Cold War. There's a lot more strategic depth. The correlation of forces is actually better now. And if you look at this from a Russian perspective, they have 1,000 more miles of frontier with some very capable militaries on the northern border. You have a Ukraine military, which is the largest army in Europe, which isn't going anywhere. And if Russia ever wants to attack NATO, what are they going to do? Drive by the Ukrainians and wave and say, hi, we're on our way to Latvia? I mean, that's not going to work. You've got a Polish military, which has made, I think, the most strategic and important defense commitment in all of NATO, because that is the cornerstone of a really almost impregnable NATO front line that they're building, and that's anchored on a very decent Romania thing. And to Kurt's point about that kind of active, we talked about this before, the active concern of the United States, I think for most it's like, we don't have a plan. We need a plan. And also, it's this notion, well, Europeans need to do more. And to be honest, and I think we're going to find this, is Europeans are doing more.
They are.
So that criticism is going to fade away. And the other thing is what do they actually need from the United States to ensure a defensible NATO frontier? And it's the things the United States is both capable and I think very willing to give. You want deep strike? So the Russians know that anything that gets to the NATO border dies before it crosses the border. You want more missile and air defense so you can protect your populations and you can protect your infrastructure. That is a strategic challenge that if the Russians want to try to match that on $80 a barrel of gas or whatever in the next, that's a competition that they are going to lose.
Yeah, I think $70 gas. Or crude, Brent crude, that is, barrel.
Well, just to say, I agree with everything. I think the really important thing as well, you asked about what the Ukrainian people should think. I think that they should know from security forums like this that the resolve of NATO and the allies is to see it through to the end, and the Ukrainian people should hear that loud and clear, and so should the Russians. I think the point that all of us have made is the reason why we're so supportive of what's happening in Ukraine, and indeed Poland, the others on the Baltic front line there, is because it is the front line. It's the defence of an illegal attack against freedom and democracy. And if it wins there, or is seen to win there, the repercussions will be across Europe, but also across the world, where aggression will seem to have won. And that's why it's so important, what we see happening now. And I tell you the miscalculation that Putin made. He thought when he attacked Ukraine, NATO would disintegrate and be weak. And in that sense, NATO has become stronger, particularly with the accession of Finland and Sweden. And I think that message from the Warsaw Security Forum is really important, that defence of freedom and democracy, not only in Europe but across the world. And the Russians will see what's happening here, and that's the message that should go out to them. We're going to see this through to the end because we realise how important it is.
Putin set out... Putin set out to make Russia great again, and what he's actually done is make NATO greater.
I would just add to the people of Ukraine, just the depth of support in the U.S. government and among the American people that will continue. I cannot foresee what will happen in the election. Of course, I want my team, future President Harris, to win. I got an answer. I can only describe the incredible mobilization of diplomacy and foreign assistance that under President Biden and Vice President Harris has happened in my system. It has been remarkable to watch the organization of allies in Europe. It has been remarkable to watch the efforts on bolstering NATO. It has been remarkable to watch the efforts to get from working with the U.S. Congress $61 billion, and on and on and on. And then the diplomatic effort to use our own investments in the United States to try to increase the contribution and to successfully increase the security assistance contribution among NATO members. So on and on and on. This type of foreign policy does not go away, and it has been central to both our promotion of democracy, our understanding of our geopolitical presence, and whatever follows this Pax Americana moment, this new era, really will rest on this all-of-government effort to not only talk the talk, but to walk the walk with our work and our money.
Can I just really quickly add, the key about Poland is not only is this happening, it happened under a conservative government, and you had a very different government come in, and that exact same commitment is there, and that's extremely important. We're going to have elections in Romania. It doesn't matter. Romania is going to stay committed to modernization. The Finland and Swedish and Norwegian commitment is absolutely strong. These are very, very positive developments that really, I think, are much, much more transformative than where the exact line winds up when the fighting stops in Ukraine.
Just final question, and to this for Kurt. I asked this earlier today of the Georgian president. We're watching it in Georgia. We're watching it in Moldova and elsewhere, which is sort of the long arm of the Kremlin, whether it be through campaigns of misinformation or even people on the ground. How worrying is that to you when there's a perception, frankly, of American weakness?
It's very worrying. What I see is that Russia has a strategy not only for Ukraine, which is to attack it and try to take it over. They have a strategy for intimidating or flipping governments, both in the Caucasus, in Southeast Europe that are not NATO members, also some that are NATO members. And I don't feel that we have a strategy for taking that on and reversing it. That we ought to have a Russia rollback strategy. Which I don't see that we have. And, Daphne made a very strong case for the bipartisan and the strong support of the American people for Ukraine, which I agree with. It's very true. But what we see right now, and I say this as a former ambassador to NATO, is our allies wanting to do more. I see the Poles saying, let us defend our airspace. The Romanians, the same thing. I see everybody saying we got to get Ukraine into NATO because we have to send a strong signal to Putin about where this is going. We have the demand for, let's give Ukraine the long-range things that they need. And it's the U.S. that is not joining consensus at NATO, which is new for me. And it's something that I think we have to try to reverse. We need, whether it's a President Harris or a President Trump, but we need to restore an internationalist-looking, a proactive American leadership aimed at pushing our interests in the world.
Hear, hear.
Panelists, thank you so much for joining us.
In a world driven by constant change, understanding the news has never been more essential.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines, bringing you the stories that matter from every corner of the globe.
With trusted journalism and deep insights, we provide you with the context and analysis that help you see the full picture.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
And conversations with those shaping the future.
We deliver the knowledge and perspectives you need.
Al Arabiya News,
where knowledge
meets perspective.
Tokyo, the world's most populous metropolitan area with 35 million people and one of the most expensive cities, Greater Tokyo. For its crowded places and high cost of living, what makes Tokyo worth a visit? The city is teeming with history, culture, and sights. One of the most popular is the Hachiko statue, a tribute to the dog loyal to his master. Hachiko, who died of a heart infection in 1935, is regarded a national celebrity and has a bronze statue of him outside Shibuya Station in his honor. A lesser-known Disneyland also lies in Tokyo. It first opened in 1983 and would see over 13 million visitors per year, making it the third most popular theme park in the world. Also find the animation studio of Studio Ghibli Inc., often referred to as the Japanese Disney. The studio's Oscar-winning feature Spirited Away is the highest-grossing film in Japanese history. Another frequently visited site is the Imperial Palace. The palace became the official imperial residence in 1869. It remains the main residence of Japanese Emperor Akihito. For historic Shinto sites, most recommended is the Meiji Shrine in Shibuya. Shinto is Japan's dominant religion. It means the worship of the deities of heaven and earth. The Meiji Shrine is the most highly regarded of all and is an immaculate example of Japan's impressive architecture. Sporting events are also popular in Japan. The Tokyo Dome is a 55,000-seater all-weather multi-purpose home of Japan's most famous team, the Tokyo Tomiuri Giants. All over the world, Japanese food is very popular. Japanese fare is favored by many because of their incredible cooking and attention to precision and preparation. The place keeps their menu simple and delicious and is visited again and again because of its classic tonkatsu, cutlets of tender breaded pork slow-cooked to perfection. When it comes to shopping, many visit Tokyo for its haven of electronics and gadgets. For Japanese fashion, visit the hip, edgier Harajuku district. Here, you'll bump into younger individuals cosplaying or adults dressed in very clean minimalist styles.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Risan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, coming up on today's programme. Israel says it has launched a ground invasion in Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah in what it calls a limited and targeted operation. The Lebanese Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, says his country faces one of the most dangerous phases of its history. As airstrikes continue, both sides prepare for a potential long battle. Lebanon's Speaker of Parliament calls on the UN for aid as nearly an estimated 1 million people in the country are thought to be displaced. Welcome. Israeli forces have now crossed into southern Lebanon, launching what the Israeli military is describing as a limited, localized and targeted ground operation against Hezbollah. Well, according to the Israeli Defense Forces, this ground incursion aims to neutralize targets which they view as an immediate threat to nearby Israeli communities.
The Israel Defense Forces is conducting limited and targeted raids along Israel's northern border against the threat Hezbollah poses to civilians in northern Israel. These localized ground raids will target Hezbollah strongholds that threaten Israeli towns, kibbutzim and communities along our border. Hezbollah turned Lebanese villages next to Israeli villages into military bases, all ready for an attack on Israel. Hezbollah had prepared to use those villages as staging grounds for an October 7th style invasion into Israeli homes. Hezbollah planned to invade Israel, attack Israeli communities, and massacre innocent men, women, and children. I want to make it clear. Our war is with Hezbollah, not with the people of Lebanon. We do not want to harm Lebanese civilians, and we're taking measures to prevent that. We will not let 7th of October happen again on any one of our borders. We will continue doing whatever necessary so that Israeli families can return to their homes in safety and security.
Well, Hezbollah's deputy leader, Naim Qassem, has responded to this announcement by the IDF, saying that the group is fully prepared for an Israeli ground offensive. And hinting at the possibility for a protracted conflict, he warned that the battle may be long. Meanwhile, Israeli airstrikes are ongoing. The IDF has confirmed strikes in Beirut, whilst Lebanese officials have reported that a building in a Palestinian refugee camp near Sidon has been hit. Well, as tensions escalate, all eyes are now on southern Lebanon, and the situation is evolving rapidly. So, what is the Israeli strategy in Lebanon, and how long could this conflict continue for? Well, to help us answer those questions and more, we're joined by the founder and chairman of Israel's Defense and Security Forum and former IDF deputy commander in Gaza, Brigadier General Amir Avivi. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Israel has begun what it's calling a limited ground incursion. Just tell us what this might entail.
Well, as we know, from the 7th of October, Hezbollah has attacked us unprovoked, and the danger was that Hezbollah was planning to launch an attack into Israel, just as Hamas did on the 7th of October, with devastating results, with a huge massacre. So Israel evacuated many of the towns and families. 60,000 Israelis were evacuated in the beginning of the war and sent to hotels and apartments in the center of Israel. And after 11 months, Israel is now going from the defense to the offense in the north. We have seen what was going on in the last week or two. And now we have to create the terms to bring back safely the citizens home. And in order to do that, we need to create a buffer zone on the other side by dismantling all the terror infrastructure Hezbollah built along the border. Inside Shia towns, they build tunnels, positions, observation, and we have to dismantle all of that and push Hezbollah north. And by doing so, we create a buffer zone that will enable us to bring back safely the citizens home.
And after the death of Hassan Nasrallah, would you say that Israel's forces are starting this offensive with a degree of confidence they perhaps wouldn't have had until this point?
Well, for many years, we tried to imagine how a war against Hezbollah will look like. I have said all along during the war that the day Israel will go to offensive, we'll see a completely different scenario from what we saw in the last 11 months. But even I was surprised at the level of effectiveness and the ability of the IDF in 1 week almost to destroy Hezbollah. We are definitely going in with a lot of confidence, with a lot of experience. Our soldiers have gained huge experience in the last 8 months fighting Hamas and fighting inside tunnels. Our soldiers, as we speak, are inside Hezbollah tunnels. They found, by the way, a map with all the plans of how Hezbollah intended to conquer the Galilee. So we understand how grave and dangerous this was, and this is why it's so important to do this ground incursion.
So let's just talk about the death of Hassan Nasrallah a little bit more, because a lot of people saying the group has indeed, Hezbollah has indeed been degraded and significantly weakened, but would be wrong, wouldn't we, to say that the group is entirely deterred and that they're a spent force?
No, definitely. I mean, we hit almost all the leadership of Hezbollah. We degraded dramatically their capabilities, but the organization is still functioning to a certain extent. They're still here and they're giving commands, shooting rockets occasionally. It's not over, but Israel is not going to stop. We're going to continue and attack and degrade this organization to the extent that I hope the Lebanese people will really take advantage, and they have a historical opportunity to get rid from this organization that has taken a whole country hostage together with Iran. There can be a bright future for Lebanon, but they really need to seize the moment and get rid of Hezbollah.
But there are risks, aren't there, for Israel, given that we assume Hezbollah knows the ground and has perhaps envisaged such a scenario for many years. Is that something that you think the Israeli troops are acutely aware of?
So when we do a ground incursion, of course, the soldiers, the commanders take it very seriously. We understand that there are forces there, understand there might be serious fighting. We don't really know what's the motivation on the other side, how they were affected by the fact that Israel toppled all their leadership, what affected them, taking in account that Israel for 11 months have been attacking Radwan forces in South Lebanon systematically, also toppling all their commanders. So it's going to be interesting to see how determined they are, but it's obvious, and to me it's obvious, that Israel will have the upper hand, and anywhere Israel will want to move forward will reach all the goals of war.
Some analysts are suggesting that your allies are concerned that perhaps Israel's being lured into a trap here, and a ground invasion is what Hezbollah wanted from Israel. Do you agree with that?
I think that being deeply concerned has become a way of living, and I really suggest to our allies be less concerned and more proactive, because Israel is fighting a war for the whole Western society. It's not just about Israel. This is a global war against tyranny, against terror. And in this war, Israel is showing to all the West, it can be done. We can win, and we can win decisively. So this is the moment to join and fight together against the Iranian nuclear programs, dismantling their capabilities and bringing back safety and security and prosperity to the Middle East. Iran has brought the Middle East into chaos. And this is the time to say, that's it. We're going to stop. We're going to dismantle the Shia axis. and bring back security and safety and prosperity to the Middle East.
Hezbollah is using, we understand, the Fadi-4 missile. It's Iranian-made. It's believed to have more explosive power and range than previous rockets. Lacks precision, though. Do you think their weaponry is getting more sophisticated?
Well, you know, as the IDF is doing the attack, we have also very, very sophisticated and advanced air defense, many layers. So yes, we are watching and monitoring very carefully all these ballistic missiles and rockets and drones. But so far, I think Israel has managed to deal with this very well. The forces are very alert, very ready. And also the citizens know that if there is something going on, they know they need to find shelter at the right place and keep safe.
At the moment, Israeli troops are, we understand, inside Lebanese territory. Not very far inside, I don't believe, but maybe you can correct me on that. Where else are Hezbollah's strongholds in Lebanon? Because they're not just in the south, are they?
No, we have Aziz and Nasser brigades of Hezbollah are in South Lebanon, south of the Litani. You have Badr north of the Litani, all the way to the Awali. And beyond that, of course, you have units of missiles and so on. But most of Hezbollah, most of their units are in South Lebanon and a bit beyond the Litani River. This is the area where Israel really needs to operate. And the minimum needed for a safe buffer zone is around, I would say, 10 to 12 kilometers. This is the range of the anti-tank missiles that have been shooting again and again on Israeli towns. So in order to really prevent a Hezbollah ground incursion or shooting anti-tank missiles, Israel has to hold a buffer zone at the minimum of 12, maybe 13 kilometers, and it can go all the way to the Litani River and beyond.
The UN today warned against what it called a large-scale ground invasion. They warned of terrible consequences for civilians. From an Israeli perspective, was a ground invasion really the only available course of action at this stage, would you say?
Yes, definitely. There is no other choice because basically everything we could do from the air we did, but you have very deep tunnels. We saw that in Gaza. I mean, in Gaza, again and again, we conducted operations from the air, and we saw this is not effective. If you don't go into the tunnels and fight, you don't destroy this infrastructure, it becomes a huge danger. There are things that cannot be solved from the air. You need, at the end of the day, you need to deal with this on the ground.
But from the risk of civilian casualties point of view, would you say that a ground incursion brings more risk, or would you say that the aerial bombardment and what Israel called the targeted attacks approach, which was the approach for the previous week or so, which is more risky from a civilian point of view?
So the way we're dealing with the issue of civilians is we ask them before starting the attacks to evacuate the area. I can say that in the past 11 months, 90% of the citizens who live in South Lebanon left north. In the last 2 weeks, the remaining citizens left, and mostly from the cities of Tzor and Sidon. So this area is pretty empty now. We're talking about citizens, and we see mostly terrorists, and this is what we're going to deal with.
Iran says that your acts will not go unanswered. What sort of a response do you think Israel is preparing for at this stage from Iran?
So we have been preparing for 18 years to deal with Hezbollah, but we have also been preparing for 18 years to deal with Iran. And this is the moment. And I say, bring it on. Let's see what you can do. And I think that Israel has an interest to really end this and really break this Shia axis, including dealing with Iran and dealing with their capabilities. We cannot have a reality where Iran is terrorizing the whole Middle East and Israel and also moving towards nuclear capabilities.
So what sort of scenario might we be looking at?
Well, it depends. It depends where the U.S. will be, the national coalition, and whether Israel needs to deal with this alone. But Israel can hit Iranian military sites and also infrastructure in a very, very strong way. And I don't think Israel will hesitate to do it if needed and when needed.
And what do you think the point of Prime Minister Netanyahu's address to the Iranian people was at the start of this week? What do you think he's seeking to achieve by addressing them directly as he did in that pre-recorded video message?
So we know that the Iranian regime is not only terrible to the region and to the globe, but also to the Iranian people. And I think that many people in Iran would like to see a regime change. And just as we are talking about Lebanon and the opportunity for the Lebanese to get rid of Hezbollah and build for themselves a much better future, same goes for the people of Iran. They need to seize the moment and deal with their regime. And maybe if there will be a coalition or Israel deals with this regime, this will be an opportunity also for the Iranian people.
General, we understand that Iran is reported to be in the process of launching a ballistic missile in Israel's direction. That's according to a US source. I just want to get your thoughts on that and what the likelihood is of that being intercepted or not, as the case may be.
So, as I mentioned, Israel's air defense is built in layers, and the upper layer is Arrow 2 and 3. They deal with threats in space, ballistic missiles, with huge success. And I believe that this ability to deal with this long-range ballistic missiles has been proven throughout the war. But we need to be alert, as always, and be ready for any scenario.
What do people in Israel think about what's happening now? Because I know the country has had some political turmoil in the last year or two. And I'm just wondering what the polls suggest with regards to the actions that have been taken in the last couple of days.
I think that I would say that what we see is relief. People say they didn't know how a war with Hezbollah would look like. We had very serious scenarios, thousands of missiles and rockets being shot at Israeli cities. People are happy to see that we managed to topple all of Hezbollah almost, and it wasn't the case. And Israeli people overall are very, very resolute, and they want a decisive victory on all fronts, and they are willing to fight as much as needed to really, really change the future of Israel and the region. I think that many times our enemies tend to watch too much Israeli TV, and there's not even a remote connection between TV and reality in Israel. There's a big difference between commentators and the Israeli society. The Israeli society is strong, resolute, and want to win.
And just lastly, looking forward, General Avivi, we're about a week away from the first anniversary of the 7th of October Hamas attacks on Israel. Still that war ongoing in Gaza, Hamas undefeated as yet. Might Israel's operation in Lebanon therefore be similarly long drawn out, in your opinion?
I think that what's happening in Lebanon will have a lot of impact in Gaza. When Hamas sees Hezbollah destroyed systematically, and they are already dismantled militarily, it's a very strong message what comes next. We are not forgetting we have 101 hostages. We're not forgetting the goals of war we set in Gaza, and we're going to achieve all the goals of war in the north, in the south, and in the east.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Brigadier General.
My pleasure.
Avivi. Thank you very much indeed. Well, for more on the situation in Lebanon, I'm joined now by the senior editor at Carnegie Middle East Center and the author of The Ghosts of Martyrs Square. That's an eyewitness account of Lebanon's life struggle. Michael Young, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. You also write for the Daily Star newspaper there in Lebanon. And since you're in the country right now, let me start by asking you what the latest is you're hearing with regards to the situation on the ground right across the country today.
Well, it's a little bit unclear, to be very honest, because on the one hand, the Israelis are saying that they're operating inside Lebanon, and they've released videos, short videos, showing troops inside tunnels, Hezbollah tunnels. But at the same time, until about an hour and a half ago, the United Nations forces in Lebanon, as well as the Lebanese army, were saying that there had been no Israeli land incursion that they recorded into Lebanon. So it's a little bit confusing exactly what's going on. I mean, it seems that the Israelis are preparing to enter Lebanese territory. They apparently, I was reading, just mobilized a number of additional brigades. But it seems that they haven't begun operating in a major way yet.
Yeah, well, as we've been speaking, we've been receiving reports of fresh strikes on Beirut by the Israeli military. We heard the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Najib Mikati, saying today that the country faces one of its most dangerous moments in its history. Now, as someone like you who spent most of their life in Lebanon, I just wanted to ask you, is that how it feels to you at this stage?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, Lebanon has had many very dangerous periods in its history, at least in my lifetime. But definitely what's taking place today is, let's begin with the humanitarian disaster, the catastrophe in the country. We have over 1 million Lebanese who are basically refugees in their own country. We have a country that essentially collapsed economically in 2020. And has not really introduced any of the reforms to revive itself. So at several levels, Lebanon is already, if not a failed state, but a failing state. So on top of this, we have this, what is a major, a major war that is sort of taking shape. So obviously, it is very dangerous for the country, and indeed for its. We have to see how it comes out of this war. I share his pessimism.
And also a source of pessimism, and just looking at social media, I mean, I get the impression a lot of people there in Lebanon feel they've been somewhat abandoned by the international community, ignored even by the international community. Do you think that's an accurate reading of what people are feeling right now?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that's quite the case. I think that what many people are feeling, to be very blunt, is anger that the country should have been pushed into a war that was completely unnecessary. And I feel that there is a great deal of ambient resentment against Hezbollah's essentially miscalculations that have led the country into this situation. Now, of course, there is also anger in Lebanon more broadly since the last year at the way many Western countries, for example, have signed off or have basically looked the other way on what Israel did in Gaza. There is certainly a certain amount of anger that whenever it seems Arabs are killed, many countries, supposedly democratic countries, don't really seem to pay much attention. But I think today in Lebanon, as I said, there is a very mixed set of feelings. Many Lebanese today are wondering why we are at war with Israel. I mean, it's incomprehensible that anyone should take the country into a war when essentially our economy collapsed. Millions of Lebanese have been impoverished in the last 4 years. It's just incomprehensible why we're in this war.
I just want to pick up on what you were saying there, because in the last few days, I mean, as we've been covering these developments in Lebanon, we heard a lot of people in the early stages of the airstrikes and so on, a lot of solidarity. It seemed like Lebanese society was extremely united in its sentiment about what was happening to the country. But it sounds as though there is now some anger, as you say, directed at Hezbollah. And I'm just wondering if you think public support for Hezbollah is now faltering. I know it's not universal support from across the board in Lebanon, but would you say the pockets that did support Hezbollah are now less supportive of Hezbollah than they were, say, a week ago?
Well, I would say that there was solidarity for the victims of the Israeli bombing. Of course, this is where there was solidarity with people who essentially were being bombed and, or injured by the pager explosions. Certainly there was solidarity with these people. I don't think there has been much solidarity in the country with the with Hezbollah's decision to go to war. Even close allies of Hezbollah, and I'm referring here, for example, to the former president, Michel Aoun, warned Hezbollah not to involve itself in this war, telling them, you will not win this war, and what you're going to do is take Lebanon into the abyss. Unfortunately, we've reached the stage where, we may escape falling into the abyss, but we're very close to it. And I think everyone today is wondering again why we picked a fight with Israel at a time when the country was essentially collapsing. Our institutions have collapsed in the last 4 years since the economic collapse. The country is barely functioning in many regards. The administration is barely functioning. This is not a country that can afford a major war against Israel, particularly when we have the example of Gaza for the last year, as a background to this.
Sure, and just talking about Lebanese institutions that are not functioning, there is, of course, no president. There hasn't been a president in Lebanon for 2 years. Can steps now be taken to appoint it the country is under, or do you think such a move wouldn't really make any particular difference?
I think it would make a difference, but the problem is yesterday the Prime Minister and Speaker of Parliament said there would be no election of a president until the ceasefire. So, unfortunately, even officials in the state are actually not doing anything to fill the vacuum in the state, because it has become a political decision. The political class in Lebanon is divided over who should be president. There is no consensus, and therefore both the Prime Minister and Speaker don't want to push the issue because it would put additional pressure on Hezbollah at a time when the party is, of course, engaged in a battle with Israel. But I think we should have a president, and you're absolutely right. This is a vacuum that we cannot afford.
And just lastly, I want to ask you a question about the Lebanese army, because I'm curious to know how they fit in a scenario that Israel carries out a fully fledged ground invasion. What would be the role of the Lebanese army?
Well, ideally, the Lebanese army should be protecting Lebanon's borders, but we have to understand that the army itself has basically suffered from the economic collapse of the country. They are not well equipped to resist the Israeli army. So, but definitely, I believe that one of the ways out of our crisis today in Lebanon is the need to reinforce the army, to deploy it to South Lebanon, and in a way to come back to, if you will, a formula to reinforce the state. I'm not sure we would do that, but certainly today there are many Lebanese who say it's not normal that an armed group should independently take Lebanon into a war, and therefore many of these same people are saying it's time to reinforce the state. And you reinforce the state today, among other things, by giving greater responsibility to the one institution in the state, namely the Lebanese army, by giving it more of a role in national defense and in the maintenance of security.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, journalist and author Michael Young. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Now, the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy says that no one wants a repeat of Israel's prolonged conflict in southern Lebanon, warning that a regional war would have a substantial cost for the Middle East and impact on the global economy. Well, it comes as the UK has increased the number of British troops at its military bases in Cyprus. Well, for more analysis, I'm joined now by Lord David Owen, who served as the British Foreign Secretary during the 1970s. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Lord Owen. You were Foreign Secretary in the late 1970s when the Lebanese civil war was raging. And here we are, half a century later almost. There must be an enormous sense of depressing déjà vu for you.
Yes, and I think we have some lessons to learn from that period. And one of them, obviously, which Israel is having to weigh, is they had a lot of problems when the war reached southern Lebanon, and they went in, and it took a long time. But I am very hard to say a word for it. It's more than anger, but it's dispassionate. We've got to stop telling these countries how to conduct their own affairs, and particularly Israel.
So your anger is directed at which country? The West for dictating terms?
It's President Biden endlessly making calls for a ceasefire, European governments, including our own, doing the same. I mean, we have not got an influence on this situation. Nobody's listening to these endless calls for ceasefires. It devalues the currency if you start on that. If you call for a ceasefire, it's got to be in a period in which it's possible and you can do something to help it. But vacuous calls for ceasefires, pretenses of telling Israel what they should do as being in the interests of a particular country, Britain or America. Israel is pursuing the interests of their own country and doing so with brilliant effect.
So you think Israel is right to have started today a ground invasion?
It's quite wrong word to use right. It's not my judgment about what they should do. Are they taking a course in their interests? The answer is yes. They have had for year after year after year parts of Israel that cannot be inhabited because of constant shelling or missiles landing on their territory from Lebanon. And they are not going to do what they've done successfully, which was to kill the leader of Hezbollah. And they're not going to do all that and then leave the ground, which has been the main root of their problem with the Lebanon. Basically, Israel hasn't a problem with the Lebanon. They have a problem with people using the Lebanon ground to attack them with missiles, and they've been doing so for year after year. So telling Israel how to conduct themselves is a waste of time. They know exactly how they're going to conduct themselves, and they're not going to listen to us. And the idea of a ceasefire now is absurd. They're just not going to do it.
There is this risk, isn't there, that with conflict on so many different fronts, that spectre of a regional, fully fledged conflict is becoming increasingly possible, probable. Do you agree with that?
I assume by that you mean that Iran joins.
Yes, Iran and other countries.
Player. And I think if Iran was to join the fight, that would be very dangerous and also depressing, because I think there is, for the first time for quite some time, with the new leader in Iran, a chance for conducting ourselves in ways in which Iran can become not partners, but participants in all serious discussions about the region, and treated as they are, of course, as an important country, major country, and as a people with great culture and who can make a very considerable contribution to a peaceful Middle East, and I think are ready to do so.
So you would encourage dialogue with Iran in order to de-escalate the situation more broadly in the region. Who would you like to see spearheading that, championing that dialogue?
Sorry, who in that dialogue?
Which countries would you like to see taking that initiative and bringing about that dialogue with Iran?
Well, I think the first important thing, if I may, is to go back one step, the crucial step. Why did Hamas invade Israel? It was because they sensed that the Abraham Accords were making considerable progress. And the Abraham Accords, for your listeners, has been a 3-year dialogue between Israel and other Arab countries. And it was, and still is, as long as we ensure that it is not wrecked by what's happening, a clear-cut sign that Israel can negotiate with its Arab neighbors in a constructive way of mutual benefit. And we must try and save the ethos underlying the Abraham Accords now. And I therefore think that that should be the background. We know now that there are serious Arab countries that are ready and are already participating in serious negotiations with Israel through the Abraham Accords. And whatever happens, that's the most important thing to keep on the agenda as a positive example of what can, and I think would, if we can keep it there, settle the future of the Middle East.
Can you see a scenario, though, in which the UK, the United States and other regional powers that are opposed to Iran are somehow obliged to join in a broader regional conflict? Do you think that's a possible scenario?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look at the politics. America's heading into a presidential election. One of the candidates, Trump, says he'll settle the whole thing straight away. No appetite with him for that sort of confrontation. A woman candidate from the Democrats, the idea of America being involved in a war would not help her candidature at all, make it much more certain that Trump would win. So I don't think that President Biden, who's a sensible man, has been around a long time, would dream of getting America involved in the fighting.
So what is your prediction if indeed, let's imagine a scenario in which Donald Trump is once again President of the United States. He's got this reputation as being a deal maker. Imagine he does walk into the White House in January. What do you think he's going to bring to the table here? Do you think he'll be able to draw a line under the conflict between Lebanon and Israel?
I think he would want to talk between Lebanon and Israel, and I think he has already shown through the activities of his son-in-law, who is behind the Abraham Accords, that he would settle a framework for negotiations. He did that in a way by putting a British embassy, an American embassy, back into Jerusalem. He showed us quite a good idea, a good perspective of how to get peace in the Middle East. And he would follow this somewhat similar policies if he came back in. But there are many a slip between cup and lip between now and then. So let's not go into what is going to happen if and when we get a presidential election and Trump is elected. Let's look at the situation we should do now. And now we should be quietly using diplomatic means to have a dialogue with the people who are fighting and try to interpose logic and reason into their thinking so that they can come to a negotiated settlement. So it means Lebanon has to live with the fact that they were the place where Hezbollah had their headquarters and had their strength, and that's been taken out, and now they must live peacefully within the region and within a relationship with Israel. And if they could quickly get that new impression in Tel Aviv, the Israelis might only go in and focus on Hezbollah troops on their border and then get out. If we don't get some form of understanding of the Israeli position, they'll go in and stay in, and that would make life very difficult for future negotiations. So I would hope that Israel will not stay in southern Lebanon, but they're bound to stay long enough to get rid of some of the people who are firing missiles at them.
Can we assume that in the background, the UK is playing a role, talking to both sides? After all, the United Kingdom has diplomatic relations with both countries concerned. Do you assume, therefore, that advice is being given to both sides by London?
I think London historians or London former diplomats can use their personal relationships with individuals to influence events. I think Britain has tied its foreign policy in that region to America, which I think is quite sensible. I have no objection to it. But it means that we're not the dominant player that we once were historically, and that we lost that role, a few decades ago. So I think at the moment, the key thing is to try to get Iran to understand that Britain and all of the democracies in Europe and the United States want an improved relationship. And we've gone very close to a situation where Iran imposes itself into this war. I hope that they will not do so. And I think one of the things that would possibly influence them, if we conceded what they apparently want, I can't understand why, that they want to go back into the negotiations they had with the nuclear states, in those of us who are in Europe, and Britain, France, and also, of course, the United States, on nuclear questions. Now, that seems to be the status symbol that will go back to when they were recognized and were a proper diplomatic and political negotiating partner. We didn't agree, but we were in formal negotiations with them. They want that restored. If they want that restored, good. Give it to them straight away and quickly before they get themselves sucked into this war, which I think many Iranians are very unsure whether they should or not. And I hope they don't, but I think it's a close-run thing as to whether they come in.
Indeed, and Iran is an extremely divided country, and we've seen evidence of that in recent years with large protests. And that seems to be what Prime Minister Netanyahu was sort of counting on yesterday when he made a 3-minute-long appeal to the people of Iran, urging them not to support their own leaders. I mean, do you think such a message is likely to gain any traction or change very much? What's your thoughts there?
Not really. I think the women in Iran are very unhappy and very dissatisfied. But I think it's a long way you can influence what may happen in the future, and particularly at a time of war. At a time of war, most countries somehow manage to patch up their differences and rally around the flag. They've got relatives fighting in the armed services. It's difficult. I don't think that Iran is going to shift the attitude of their governing party. You've got to hope that the new leader that has come in, who is not tied to the religious leaders, has got enough independence to keep Iran out of this war and play a quite important role in the peace process that must follow.
Just lastly, Lord Owen, final thoughts, a final message. How would you advise the current British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer? What would you like him to see doing in order to somehow bring some resolution to this conflict in the Middle East?
Well, I think he's already done it, and that's very sensible. He spent time with President Biden in the United States recently. He has used the British voice and his foreign secretary to talk to all the different countries, our friends and neighbors, countries like France, who often share our position, and we're both on the Security Council as permanent members, and we tend to vote together. So there will be some difficult votes. The temptation is always to abstain, but it might be easier, and it would undoubtedly be easier, if France and Britain have a slightly different position from the United States, and they want to flag it up in the Security Council, be it abstention or by vote, and France and Britain does that together, I wouldn't exclude that at all, and I would look favorably at it as long as it's done for a purpose, which is to improve the negotiating position to bring Iran around the table.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. The former British Foreign Secretary, Lord David Owen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, for more analysis, I'm joined now by the former Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and the Chief of Staff for the National Security Council in the Obama and Clinton administrations. Mara Rudman, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Some news just coming into us here at Al Arabiya News. The US Embassy in Israel is telling its staff to shelter. The US is warning that an Iranian attack on Israel with a ballistic missile is expected. What do you make of that warning?
So I believe the United States is doing everything possible to prepare a strong defensive posture against any and all contingencies. And for them to escalate in this public way, to me, means it's likely that they believe such contingency may occur and want to be sure that they and Israel and all civilians in Israel are maximally prepared, and are probably working with a number of parties through the region, as you saw back last April, to mitigate the effect of any such action by Iran.
Okay, so in such a scenario that Israel is hit by some sort of an Iranian attack, I mean, first of all, it's likely to be intercepted, isn't it? But in any case, would that then trigger a further response, do you think, from Israel and the United States?
I believe that the entire region has, for some time now, been a tinderbox, and particularly exacerbated over the last few weeks. But within Iran, as far as we know, there's also a fair amount of tension or perhaps lack of agreement on actions to take or not to take. And I think there are a lot of actors involved in a lot of conversations right now behind the scenes to try to ensure that this does not further escalate in the region. And I would note as well that action was put into place in mid-April very effectively, both in essentially neutralizing the effect of the Iranian strike and then ensuring that it did not escalate from that point until obviously where we are now with Lebanon.
Some analysts have suggested that Iran's still relatively new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, was hoping to improve relations with the West. But at this point in time, we're talking about armed responses, saber rattling. I mean, that sounds like a very distant prospect, doesn't it?
Well, as I was referring earlier to the tensions in Iran, I think the fact that the president is, within Iranian terms, a moderate, and the supreme leader would have at some level acquiesced to him being put in place, being elected as president, underscores that there are tensions within Iran about best approaches and what the options are, and when and how Iran is best situated in terms of their overall goals. And direct or major military action at this point for Iran, despite where the Iranian Revolutionary Guards may be or may wish to show reactions, may not be in Iran's best interest. And so I would expect a lot of deliberations going on within that country at this point, as well as with and among various actors in the region and internationally.
Just looking at the situation in Lebanon, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said last night that Washington does support Israel in its goal of, and I quote, dismantling attack infrastructure along the border. Does that equate, do you think, to Washington's support for an Israeli ground offensive?
I think it depends on how you define the Israeli ground offensive. Listen, it's very clear the threat that Hezbollah has posed not only to Israel, but to the region as a proxy of Iran, and in carrying out a variety of terrorist acts, and frankly, not just to the region. Hezbollah has been responsible for the deaths of Americans. And so the interests of the United States and Israel are aligned in the sense of reducing, mitigating, ultimately dismantling the threat that Hezbollah poses. And the actions on the border with Israel can be seen as in continuance of UN Resolution 1701 back in 2006, which was meant to move Hezbollah back behind the Litani River, away from Israel's border. And so, again, the actions that involve being on the ground in Lebanon, near the border, would be consistent with those goals. I think the challenge and the concern is how quickly it can grow into a bigger mission, a more extended ground operation. And that has not played well for Israel in the past.
And yet we have heard time and time again the Biden administration calling for ceasefires, but those ceasefire calls have been rejected on a number of occasions. I mean, do you get the impression that there's a degree of frustration in the United States and that power and influence on foreign affairs is somewhat diminished?
I don't have that view. I think that diplomacy is always hard, always difficult, and that what the administration of President Biden has been going through in the past year is a very skilled and persistent diplomatic efforts, balanced with the need to counter the threat that Iran poses, not just to the region, but ultimately to the United States and to the rest of the world. And so that involves trying to work with a variety of different leaders in the region who have stakes in this, and with some stakeholders who I would not characterize as leaders in any sense, and figuring out how you can get to move them to what is in the United States interest, what is in the international interest, and when they may not see it as in their own direct personal interest or in the interest of their country or the entity that they run. That's part of the job of being a leader in the world today.
But just to continue with the sort of speculation really about Washington's frustration with Israel, because we sometimes hear these messages out of Washington to the effect that they are as surprised as the rest of the world by developments. I mean, notably the pager and walkie-talkie attacks. They said they had no prior knowledge of that. They said the same thing about Hassan Nasrallah's targeted killing. I mean, do you think that it's really the case that they're finding things out at the same time as us, or is there some sort of element of theatre to all of this?
I think it is possible for neither of the things you propose to be on the mark. I do not see our government leaders as being involved in theater. I see them as being involved in grappling with very real facts on the ground, and those facts may be shifting rapidly as they have in the last couple of weeks. And independent countries are responsible and carry out their own tactics and their own strategies. And the United States is not in a position, I think, despite how many in the world may view us, to impose our will on any other country. And it is a matter of figuring out what points of leverage you have and how to maximize them. And that is what I believe that President Biden and his administration have been doing.
Some additional US troops are being deployed to the Middle East. What does that indicate, you think, about where things could be heading to?
Well, I think we have troops that are being deployed, and we have 2 carriers in the region, which is significant, and we've had at several points over the past year. It involves ensuring that the United States defensive posture is clear to actors in the region and to others in the world, and in the hopes of again, de-escalating the situation that we're in now. I think folks the interest in having a strong defensive posture is to deter actions from others and show that you can deter by being available to react if and as necessary. But the goal here, I would say, of the increased U.S. presence is further deterrence.
Correct me if I'm wrong. A couple of months ago, you're quoted as saying the U.S. is closer to a major war than it's been in generations and that it is not prepared for that fight. First of all, I hope I've quoted you correctly. And secondly, do you think that scenario now looks even more likely given how quickly things have escalated in the last week or two?
So a point on that quote. It is an accurate reflection of what was written by the reporter. I do not believe the reporter accurately quoted me. But to try to give a little bit more of what my intended nuance was, I was talking to that particular reporter in the context of my work on the U.S. National Defense Strategy Commission, where we had 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. We issued a report this summer that described the very real concerns that many in the United States share, including across our government, about the degree of instability throughout the world, the leveraging that bad actors, and I would put in this in the context of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, are doing with one another to further various aims. And so to that point, the extent of further instability in the Middle East playing into the concerns about what's already happening in Ukraine with Russia and the ways in which China is looking at all of this for what Chinese leaders have made clear are their kind of ultimate goals in the Indo-Pacific is a cause for real concern. And that is part of why the commissioners with whom I worked on our report talked about the need to very much increase, to change the culture in the United States, to increase awareness and education about the kinds of threats that we are facing in the world and the point of instability that the world is writ large, and to increase the resources in a variety of ways, not just monetary resources, that the United States is putting into a strong defensive posture, a strong national security posture, and frankly, building out the U.S. industrial base, which is also part of what's necessary in this equation. And all of those points is what I was intending to get to in the prior conversation you referenced.
Okay, so I mean, when we look at the context in the Middle East, and we've got Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, all under attack today. I mean, just looking at these fears of a broader regional conflict that people have been talking about really for a year or so now, since the 7th of October attacks. I mean, where do you see this heading to? Do you think a broader regional conflict involving perhaps more actors than the ones I just mentioned is now looking increasingly likely?
I hope that is not the case. I think the flip of what you're describing, Tom, would also be, and I think we've seen it happen, the flip that I'm about to describe in April, of the opportunities for regional actors who are serious and concerned about the threat that Iran poses coming together in a strong deterrent posture to be able to counter that threat. And I think a key piece of that is what the United States has been working with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on, which is hand in hand to find a path forward towards a Palestinian state, as well as that is part and parcel of immediately trying to resolve what's been going on with Hamas in Gaza and have a way forward. And so bringing the region together, both to counter Iran and in a positive direction with respect to Palestinians and a Palestinian state, a pathway to that Palestinian state that would increase security and stability throughout the region is also a possibility, even as we are facing the current situation that we're in.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your analysis with us. Mara Rudman, thank you very much indeed. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
New York. The Big Apple. The city that never sleeps. The most exciting in the world, New York, New York. Filled with restaurants, bars, museums, shopping destinations, and iconic sites, New York is indeed a welcoming city. A year-round destination with 4 seasons, New York is magical in the winter, with marvelous snowfalls and cloudless skies. In the spring and autumn, the city is at its best, with a crispness to the air and clear blue skies. The city is indeed filled with popular tourist spots. The most popular site is the Central Park, which transforms into a beautiful golden red in October. The Grand Central Terminal is known for its stunning historical feats. From its near destruction and restoration, the beauty of this famous Beaux Arts building is certainly a must-see. The Empire State Building, with its classic Art Deco architecture, is indeed a New York City icon. Its 102-story building is one of the most visited in the world. Visit the 86th floor outside Observatory for views of up to 80 miles or 130 kilometers that are definitely worth the photos. The Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, the world's largest performing arts center, is also home to 12 resident arts organizations, including the New York Philharmonic, Metropolitan Opera, the New York City Opera, and the New York City Ballet. Not to be missed are the world-class museums, the American Museum of Natural History, the Museum of Modern Art, and of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Times Square is yet another tourist spot to visit. In the middle of the bustling hive of activity, Times Square is known for its huge electronic billboards and many destinations for fun and activities. And finally, the reason why New York is called the city that never sleeps. The place offers endless nightlife options to choose from that makes it almost impossible to have time for sleep. There are after-dark nightclubs, bars, theaters, live music, and comedy performances to explore every day, be it the weekend or a night after work. New York is also known as the restaurant capital of the world. With more than 18,000 eateries to choose from, just imagine how difficult deciding where to eat will be. The most expensive but worthy dining hangouts can be found in Midtown Manhattan, where reservations at restaurants are actually the standard.
Hello, I'm Riz Khan. As many as 1 billion people around the world are obese. That's a number worth considering for a moment. It amounts to 1 in 8 people walking on planet Earth today. In the US alone, 3 out of every 4 people are obese or overweight. That's 75% of the population. So how did we get to this situation? Are processed foods to blame? How about our increasingly sedentary lifestyles? And what can be done to solve the problem? For millions of people, the answer to that final question is a new generation of weight loss drugs with names such as Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, and Zepbound. Originally created to tackle type 2 diabetes, they've also proved successful in dropping body weight by 15 to 20% and significantly reducing the risk of heart attacks. Self-administered by simple injections, the drugs have been likened by some to a miracle cure. Well, my first guest is Johan Hari, a British journalist and author who lost 42 pounds, almost 20 kilos, using Ozempic and Wegovy. He shared his experiences, both good and bad, in his best-selling book, Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. Johan, thanks for joining us. Now, most of us first heard about Ozempic as this kind of Hollywood drug, the Hollywood set using it to lose weight. Tell me about your story, how you got introduced to it.
I remember so clearly the moment that I learned about the existence of these drugs and how I felt. It was that moment when the pandemic was ending. It was the winter of 2022 and the world was opening up again. And I got invited to a party and I was like, oh yeah, I remember parties. They used to exist. So I agreed to go. And in the Uber on the way there, so this party was thrown by an Oscar-winning actor. I'm not saying that just a name drop. It's relevant to what comes next. But, and I suddenly felt this kind of wave of self-consciousness, right? I was quite fat at the start of the pandemic and I gained a lot of weight during the pandemic. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a bit embarrassing. And then I remembered that like almost everyone I knew had gained weight during the pandemic. And I suddenly thought, actually, this party is going to be really interesting. I'm going to see a load of like Hollywood stars with a bit of flab on them. This is going to be fascinating. And I arrived and I started walking around. And it was the weirdest thing. Not only had they not gained any weight, everyone was gaunt. Like, everyone was markedly thinner, and not just the actors, their wives, their agents, the agents' kids, like everyone. And I bumped into a friend of mine on the dance floor, and I said to her, wow, looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during lockdown. And she laughed at me, and I didn't know why she was laughing, and she pulled up on her phone an image of an Ozempic pen. And I learned then and in the following days that there's been a staggering scientific breakthrough. We now have a new kind of weight loss drug that really does deliver huge amounts of weight loss. The average person taking Ozempic Wegovy loses 15% of their body weight in a year. With Mounjaro, it's 21% of their body weight. And I immediately thought two just completely conflicting things. The first thing I thought was, well, this could save my life. I was about to turn 44, which is the age my grandfather was when he died of a heart attack. Loads of the men in my family get fat, die of heart disease. I knew that obesity causes over 200 medical conditions. But I also thought, this sounds way too good to be true, right? Come on now, can there really be such a thing as a free lunch, right? I guess with Ozempic, it'd be a smaller free lunch. So I used my training in the social sciences at Cambridge University to go on a big journey all over the world to interview the leading experts on these drugs, biggest defenders, the biggest critics, and really figure out what this extraordinary revolution is going to mean for all of us. And that's really the heart of my book, Magic Pill.
So, I mean, tell me about those immediate effects on your body. What actually started to happen? How you started to feel it?
I thought, if I'm going to investigate this and write about it, I've got to take these drugs. And again, it was the weirdest thing. I remember it's the second day after I started taking Ozempic. I went to a diner just up the street from where I live when I'm in London. And I went in and I ordered what I used to order for breakfast every morning, which I'm slightly embarrassed to repeat, was a huge chicken roll with loads of mayonnaise in it. And normally I would wolf that down and I would still want some potato chips or something else. And I had like 3 or 4 mouthfuls and I was just full. I didn't want to eat anymore. I was completely baffled, and that was really how it was from then on. I felt really full, really fast. So the way these drugs work is they boost your sense of fullness. I can explain the kind of biological mechanisms more. There's a big debate about them, obviously. But they massively boost your sense of fullness. So it's not like dieting where you're like, which obviously I tried many times in my life, where you're sort of hungry and you learn how to deny yourself. It's not like that. You don't actually want to eat very much. It's a very strange feeling.
Let me ask you about that, because you said it happened within a couple of days. Now, I know other people who are taking it, they've gone under medical supervision and so on, but they actually took weeks to start to feel the effects. And you say you felt it within days.
Yeah, different people, you're right. Different people it kicks in, take a bit longer for some people than it did for me. It happened very quickly. Some people it's almost immediate, and some people it takes a couple of weeks. But it has a massive effect on the appetite of everyone who takes it. What's interesting is we know some of what's going on why. So if you ate something now, doesn't matter what it is, after a little while, your pancreas will produce a hormone called GLP-1. GLP-1 is basically part of your body's natural signals saying, hey, you've had enough, stop eating. It's the brakes, basically. But natural GLP-1 only stays around in your system for a few minutes, and then it's washed away. What these drugs do is they inject you with an artificial copy of GLP-1 that, instead of sticking around for a few minutes, stays around in your system for a whole week. So it has this effect that when you start to eat, you already feel quite full because you're getting this signal, hey, you've had enough, stop.
I wonder, now obviously when you're feeling full so much more quickly, do you tend to miss the joy of eating food? Do you find that, you don't find that social pleasure that you discussed?
It's a really important question, and I want to answer it by being honest that I'm unusual. So lots of people taking these new weight loss drugs have the experience that you're describing. It's very widespread. They lose the pleasure of food. Indeed, Jens Jules Holst, who's one of the scientists who designed these drugs for Novo Nordisk, said this is just going to, make these drugs untenable in the long term. You can't live if you don't enjoy food. I had the opposite effect. So for me, from when I was a very small child, I realized now, looking back on it, I grew up in a very violent and stressful environment. I really, from a very young age, learned to use food to calm myself down. And so I would eat, all my life I've eaten very quickly. And it wasn't really for enjoying the flavor or the taste, it was sort of stuffing myself, right? And stuffing is where you deliberately eat beyond the point of feeling full. We've all done it at some point, you know. And I couldn't do that when I was on these drugs. I literally couldn't do it. So for me, I actually had to slow down my eating. And for me, that actually meant that I started to enjoy eating more. I don't want to overstate it. I'm not some great foodie. But for me, it's actually increased the amount of pleasure that I take in food. But I stress I do think I'm unusual.
You did indicate, you know, you like a lot of the comfort food, the kind of fried chicken and stuff like that. Now, I wonder, though, has that limitation on how much you can eat changed the kind of foods you eat to give yourself something more delicate, perhaps, or something that is less kind of that type of comfort food?
It's an important question, and I started to think about this because, you know, half of Americans now want to take these drugs, right? People watching, you know, you might think, oh, they haven't arrived here yet. This is about to transform the society in which you live, right? Obesity is, by many measures, the biggest killer in the developed world. We now have a drug that reverses obesity. It's a staggering breakthrough. It'll be as significant a breakthrough as the contraceptive pill or antidepressants. This is a really, really big moment. And when I learned these statistics, looking at the evidence for how many people want to take these drugs, thinking, at first glance, this seems almost crazy. How did we get to this point, right? How did we get to the point where half of us want to drug ourselves to stop us eating so much? It seems so odd. And if you want to think about that, I think the answer to your question, really important question you've asked, lies there. Because I would just say to everyone, right? Everyone watching, just do me a favor. Just take out your phone and Google something for me. Just Google, wherever you live, Google photographs of beaches in the place where you lived in 1979, the year that I was born, and just look at them on the internet for a moment, right? If you've done that, you would have noticed something really weird. When you look at, for example, I'm, as you can tell from my weird Downton Abbey accent and yours, we're British. You know, if I Google pictures of British beaches in 1979, they look like a different country. Almost everyone is what we would now call skinny or in fact quite ripped, right? You think, this is weird. What happened? So between the year I was born and I'm now 45, obesity in Britain rose from 6% of the population to 27% of the population. In the world more generally, in my lifetime, obesity has more than trebled, right? What happened? Why? It's because of the food you're asking about. So we know the answer to this, and obviously this is a process that's happened even more recently in many of the countries that people are watching from. So this transformation, this explosion in obesity, you've got basically 300,000 years human beings exist, and obesity happens sometimes, but it's unbelievably rare. And then essentially in your lifetime and mine, it blows up. And we know why. It happens in every country that makes one change. It's where people move from mostly eating fresh whole foods they prepared on the day to mostly eating processed and ultra-processed foods, which means foods that are built in factories out of chemicals in a process that isn't even called cooking, it's called manufacturing food. And it turns out that kind of food affects our bodies in a really different way to the old kind of food. There's an experiment that really helped me to understand this. It was done by a scientist I interviewed called Dr. Paul Kenny, who's the head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai in New York. I've nicknamed this experiment Cheesecake Park. It's not the official name. Very simple experiment. He got a load of rats and he raised them in a cage. And all they had was the kind of natural whole foods that rats evolved to eat over thousands of years. And when that's all they had, the rats would eat when they were hungry and they would stop when they were full. They seemed to have some natural way of knowing when they were full, and they just stopped eating. So the rats never became fat when they had the natural food they evolved for. Then Dr. Kenny introduced the rats to the American diet. He bought a load of cheesecake, he bought a load of Snickers bars, he fried up some bacon, and he put it in the cage. And the rats went crazy for the American diet. They ate and ate and ate and ate. The way he put it to me is within a couple of days, they were different animals. And quite rapidly, they were all severely obese. Then Dr. Kenny tweaked the experiment again in a way that feels a bit cruel to me as a former KFC addict. He took away the American diet and left them with nothing but the healthy food again. And he was sure he knew what would happen. He thought they would eat more of the healthy food than they had at the start. And that would prove that, eating this food expands the number of calories you eat in a day. That is not what happened. What happened was much weirder. Once they'd had the American diet and it was taken away, the rats refused to eat at all. It was like they no longer recognized the healthy food as food. It was only when they were literally starving to death that they went back to it. Now, I would argue we are all living in a version of that experiment right now, right? We're all living in an environment where the food we're eating, this very unnatural food that your grandparents never had one mouthful of, my grandparents never had one mouthful of, it didn't exist then, profoundly undermines our ability to feel full. And what these drugs do is they give you back your sense of fullness, but of course at a cost, with a risk.
What's interesting is that there are a lot of factors, of course, and you touched on some of those. People don't eat at home now. They don't cook in the way they used to. Every street, certainly in parts of Britain where I go now, it seems like there's, fast food shops, kebab shops and everything all along the street. So people are grabbing that quick fix. They don't seem to have the time for it either. But I wonder, in this case with the drug, for many people, it's more a kind of a target, a project. I'll get down to my ideal weight and then I can start to adjust my lifestyle and so on and so forth. You've continued with the drug. Presumably you see it as something you're going to do for life. Is that correct?
So you've asked a really important question, and the answer is complicated. So what the drug companies say is these drugs work as long as you take them, and when you stop taking them, they stop working. We know, for example, blood pressure medication, right, or statins, they're not a cure, but they treat the problem, and then when you stop taking them, the problem comes back. The drug companies argue these drugs are like that. And they have produced some scientific research that seems to back that up. So they've done a very small amount of research into it, but the studies they've done indicate when people stop taking the drug, the vast majority of them regained the vast majority of the weight they'd lost within a year. Now, obviously, we want to be a little bit skeptical of that because the drug companies have a vested interest in getting us to continue buying them forever. Anecdotally, there are some people, I know some of them, who are saying, look, I took the drug, I used it to interrupt my eating habits and change. Now I've stopped and I'm remaining at a lower weight. There's no scientific evidence to back that up yet. I don't know, but I suspect the drug companies are right. We'll know a lot more in the next few years because, of course, we'll have lots of people who try both models, right? But for me, the decision, and there are lots of people, anyone who's thinking about taking these drugs, the truth is you have to weigh two kinds of risk. There's the risk of taking these drugs. There are significant risks. And there's the risk of continuing to be obese, right? Now, if you're not obese, don't take the drugs, right? Because you're getting all the risk without the health benefit. If you are obese, try the other methods first. There's much less risk from diet and exercise than there is from these drugs. So, of course, try that. But I doubt there's a single fat person watching who's never tried a diet, right? Sadly, most diets fail. Not all, but most. So you've got to weigh these two risks. The risk of the drugs, the risk of being obese. And I've got to be honest with you, I'm slightly embarrassed to say this as well. The thing that most shocked me in the research for my book, Magic Pill, was learning the science of just how bad for you obesity is. Everything we fear medically, pretty much, is made more likely by being obese. You're much more likely to get cancer. You're much more likely to get dementia. You're much more likely to get a stroke, which is the thing doctors most fear getting because it's awful. You're much more likely to have a heart attack. For me personally, given that there was such a history of heart disease in my family, and given that we know people who take these drugs, there's very good research now showing this, if you take these drugs and you started with a BMI higher than 27, as I did, in the 2 years that follow, you are 20% less likely to have a heart attack or stroke. That's huge. That's a huge decrease in risk. And there's more and more evidence emerging of health benefits as well as I say, risks. So for me, that was the thing that sealed it, right? Loads of the men in my family get heart attacks. My dad had a heart attack. My uncle died of a heart attack. My grandfather died of a heart attack. I'm now older than he ever was, as I mentioned. So for me, that was decisive. But other people will look at the risks that I go through in Magic Pill and come to a different conclusion for them. I think we have to think about this in a very personalized way. People need to go down this risks and benefits for themselves.
I think that's a very important point too as well, Johan. You actually, instead of just taking the injection like many people do and getting on with their lives saying, look, it's going to work for me, you really investigated it deeply. You wrote about it with Magic Pill, and you've weighed up all the sides. So I guess people that way at least have reference points, which a lot of the time they don't, because they get caught up with the fad of it.
I think that's very true. I would also just stress I'm not a doctor, so people should certainly talk to their doctors. And I obviously don't speak for the drug companies involved. I think you're right that the kind of fad element of this. So I would draw a distinction between a few sets of people. There are people who are overweight or obese who are taking these drugs to get down to be a healthy weight. Now, there's significant risks associated with that, as we've said, but I think there's a strong case for that. And the more obese you are, the stronger the case for it is, because the worse your obesity is, the worse the dangers to your health. Then there's, of course, people, a totally separate category, people who have type 2 diabetes, because these drugs also treat that problem, who obviously have a very strong case for taking it. Then you've got people who are neither diabetic nor overweight or obese, who are taking it to actually be super skinny, right? For example, I was on a recent TV show with one of the Real Housewives of New Jersey who said, we're all taking it. And of course, none of them were fat at the start. They were all already skinny. Now, look, women are made to feel terrible about their bodies, whatever they do. I'm not judging or criticizing those women. They're put in an intolerable position. But I would strongly urge, based on the scientists I've interviewed and the evidence I've learned, people who are already healthy weight or skinny to not take these drugs for lots of reasons, but I'll just give you one of many. So there are health risks to being too thin. For example, a very important marker of health, particularly as you age, is muscle mass. So muscle mass is the total amount of soft tissue in your body. It's really important for getting out of a chair, walking up the stairs. It's crucial for movement. And when you take these drugs, or when you lose weight in any way, you generally don't just lose fat mass, you lose muscle mass, right? That won't be a problem when you're 35, 40, even 50. But as you get older, we naturally shed muscle mass every year, starting when you're 25, which I find incredibly depressing. But so you naturally shed muscle mass every year. If you're going into the aging process with already very artificially low levels of muscle mass because you're too skinny, you're much more likely when you're in your 60s, 70s, and 80s to be really quite debilitated, to really struggle to get out of a chair, to climb the stairs, to be able to move properly. It's a condition called sarcopenia, which happens as people age, but you're really increasing the odds of that. And that's just one of the many health risks that you're taking on. So yeah, I really urge people to not do that.
And presumably, Johan, you have to make sure that limited amount of food that you do eat under the influence of these kind of drugs has to be nutritious enough to fill the gap with all the kind of essentials, minerals, vitamins, and so on.
It's a super important point. One of the 12 risks of these drugs that I talk about, and they range quite widely from, and I stress again, weighing against the massive, massive benefits of this incredible new breakthrough. But if we think about the risks, they range from, some scientists argue these drugs may be increasing the risk of thyroid cancer, though some others highly dispute that. Eating disorders, and exactly as you say, one of the 12 risks is malnutrition, right? For example, a close relative of mine is taking these drugs and just was taking such a high dose, she just didn't eat. She was really, her kids were having to remind her to eat every day. That's obvious, and a lot of people I think are taking very high doses of these drugs. So yeah, that's a really big way. I mean, this is slightly over the top, the way I'm going to put this. But the way I think of these drugs is they're a tool like fire. They're just such a powerful tool. And fire is a great tool if I use it to warm up my house. And it's a really terrible tool if I use it to burn down your house. And this breakthrough we've made is so powerful, a drug that really can transform your relationship with food and your body. That's going to have positive and negative effects. The book is called Magic Pill because there's 3 ways these drugs could be magic. The first is the most obvious. They could just solve the problem of obesity, right? And I've got to be honest with you, there are days when it feels like that. My whole life, I've massively overeaten. And now once a week, I do a tiny little injection into my leg, barely feel it. I don't overeat anymore. I've lost 15% of my body weight, more I think now. Staggering. The second way it could be magic is more worrying. It could be like a magic trick. It could be like a magician who shows you a card trick while he picks your pocket, right? It could be that over time, the 12 significant risks associated with these drugs outweigh the benefits. I don't think that's the most likely scenario, but it's certainly possible. The third way it could be magic is, I actually think the most likely. Think about the stories of magic that we all grew up with. Think about like, what would be a good example? Aladdin, right? You find the lamp, you rub it, the genie appears, the genie grants your wish, and your wish comes true, but never quite in the way you expected, right? There's always some unpredictable effects. And I think we're already seeing that with wave of eating disorders in the United States, but, it'll have a massive economic effect apart from anything else. Dunkin' Donuts and Krispy Kreme were having their stock tank, right? Because so many Americans are taking these drugs. There was a big report by Jefferies Financial for the airlines in the US saying they're going to have to spend a lot less money on jet fuel pretty soon because the population's about to get so much thinner, and obviously it takes more jet fuel to fly heavier people. So there's a whole series of huge and unpredictable cascading effects on the economy, on our health, on how we feel about ourselves that are going to happen as the result of these drugs. And I hope my book gives people an opportunity to kind of take a beat and think through what this staggering transformation is going to mean for all of us.
Now, important point, you've called your book Magic Pill, and in that respect, there was a time perhaps when people would see someone fit, out there, and they could tell they'd been working out, they'd been exercising hard. Now we have the magic pill, as you put it. Did anyone ever make you feel like you were cheating by using this to lose weight?
They didn't have to. I felt it myself. And I really thought a lot about this. I thought, God, I really feel like I'm cheating. And that's weird. Like, one of my best friends takes statins for his, to cholesterol. And I've never once looked at him and gone, you cheat, getting ahead of me when it comes to cholesterol. Never crossed my mind, right? This really odd one. And I looked a lot at the history of how we think about being fat, being obese. And if you go right back if you look at the history of this, look, for example, in the 6th century, the Pope Gregory I, described gluttony as one of the 7 deadly sins, right? It's always depicted with some really fat person stuffing their face, right? And I've been that fat person. It's very deep in Western culture and many cultures, the idea that being fat is a sin. And you can see that because what are the kinds of weight loss that we admire, right? They're ones that follow the kind of classic Christian idea of like, you've sinned, you get punished, and then we forgive you, right? So like, if someone goes through some horrendous diet and we really see them suffer and they do really extreme forms of exercise, we're like, okay, we forgive you, right? But in a way, I think one of the reasons I felt like I was cheating is it was almost too easy, right? It didn't require any effort at all. I didn't have to suffer. It's like, oh, so I sinned by being fat, but then I kind of got out of jail free, right? But you only have to hear me say that to realize, I hope we can move on from the ideas of a 6th century Pope, right? Because the truth is, obesity has exploded all over the world. And it's not because we're sinners. It's because there's been a transformation in the food supply system that's made us really sick, right? And that's not your fault. That's not my fault. That's not the fault of anyone watching this. That's a big structural change that was done to us. More 3-year-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name in the United States, right? You didn't choose this, right? This has been done to us. And I think if we can get out of seeing it as a sin and a competition and a race, and more that we're all in this boat together and we've got a shared problem, and part of the solution, I believe, will come from these drugs. Part of the solution will come from changing our culture so we don't allow our kids to be screwed up in this way. And I went to Japan where they have almost no obesity at all, and I saw how they've done that. They've not allowed that to be done to their children and to themselves. But yes, I think we've got to have more grown up and mature ways of thinking about this. But those ideas are in all of us. No one should be shamed for having those ideas. They're deep in our culture. But I do think these drugs give us an opportunity to move beyond them.
Johan, well done for actually documenting all this in your book, Magic Pill, because I think for a lot of people, this is going to be an important guide. It really has gone crazy in terms of even shortages of the drugs, as you well know. So I'm sure we'll have a chance to chat again, but thank you very much for taking the time out.
Oh, you asked great questions. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Berlin. For its exuberant urban life and vibrant art scene, visit Berlin. The German capital features a cultural scene and unique lifestyle that's both fast-paced and relaxed. Also known as the hipster city of Europe, Berlin keeps alive with its alternative cultures and styles. In neighborhoods like Kreuzberg, Neukölln, and Friedrichshain are vibrant places where locals simply chill and enjoy the relaxed open spaces and fresh air. No city in Germany is, in fact, greener than Berlin, with its forests, lakes, and sprawling parks. Berlin is also a city full of history. The World War II, after all, began and ended in the city of Berlin. Most popular are the Brandenburg Gate and the Federal Chancellery, which are reflective of the nation's rich stories. Germany's capital is also home to its major government buildings, such as the historic Reichstag or the seat of the German parliament. Of course, most remarkable are the Berlin Wall, the East Side Gallery, and the Holocaust Memorial. Historical feats aside, Berlin is also hip and happening with its streets of bars and clubs. The city has an active nightlife that guarantees massive parties and events practically every night. But the city is friendly to non-party goers too. It has relaxed beer gardens, small bars, hostels, and art galleries to suit different tastes. Famous as a city of art, Berlin has over 170 museums, including the famous Museum Island that puts treasures of the world on public display. Tourists often visit Berlin to attend ballets and operas at the city's major opera houses, as well as witness live performances by talented orchestras such as the world-class Berlin Philharmonic. And when it comes to food, Berlin has a lot to offer too. It's a great place for vegans. It has Turkish restaurants and supermarkets everywhere, and Italian, Mexican, and Asian food spots too. Food markets offering snacks, German wine and cheese, among others, will satisfy your palate as well. The neighborhoods in Kreuzberg and Neukölln are great for finding fine restaurants and quiet lounge bars, as well as dozens of coffee bars to enjoy. When it comes to shopping, there are well-known mainstream malls to visit, alongside independent boutiques nearby that offer endless choices for your lifestyle needs. One will also find small vintage stores within Berlin, some even selling second-hand books as well as high-end designer clothing.